This is a video that I always had the intention of making, as I'd already started penning it a year ago. This video was nearly 30 pages in its original draft. It is now well over 60. With frustrations in the game reaching a boiling point recently, it's about time to get this out. We need to address the issue with the very philosophy of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is operated as a game. This isn't a newly discovered fact. It's something that's been building up for years. It's why I'd already begun the script a year prior. While the issue of non-games has led to discussion about the game as a whole, this is an issue that's relevancy has gone in and out in cycles. It's part of the problem, but not the whole thing. The problem with Yu-Gi-Oh's philosophy is that it operates to an effect like Ouroboros, endlessly chasing after its own tail. These sorts of non-game issues are an attempt to eat away at the very game itself. But it isn't just the cards that create non-games having this impact. It's the very things they're seemingly meant to counter. It's the idea that by both sides existing, that the existence will ultimately equalize the game's health, when in reality, all it does is create varied ways for the game to be unhealthy. This was something I'd been putting off, debating if it was truly worth making, since, for a time, I felt the game was trending in a much better direction, and with me not really feeling a concrete end for the script, I felt as though it'd end up being a moot point by the time I'd actually covered every detail that I wanted. However, with the TCG September ban list, and the fallout of its consequences, leading to an emergency list to patch the game, it's become clear to me this video has to be made. Because while I thought the game was trending towards better design in general, it's still evident Konami doesn't seem to care about taking actions for the sake of the game's long-term health. Because of that, I feel an obligation to make this video. Because it needs to be explicitly clear once and for all. Konami's approach to shuffling the deck doesn't change the game for the better. It only makes it more frustrating that they left certain cards in the deck. So my only intention is to make it loud and clear with this video. Konami need to actually analyze the damage they continue to perpetuate towards this game's health. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of the best games in the world, but they certainly don't run it like it is. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, it's just a TCG ban list. Just play Master Duel or the OCG. This problem isn't exclusive to the TCG. It's in fact worse in these two, because of their track record. I have zero faith in Konami as a whole to manage this game's health. They apply the very same ineffectual philosophy everywhere you go. It's just a matter of picking your poison. And I don't think you should be picking poison, I think you should be playing a card game. The very philosophy the game is predicated on needs to change. Now more than ever, it's abundantly clear how bad it is. If Konami refuses to acknowledge this fact, their continued negligence will only damage this game further. The only semblance of awareness and balance I've seen from Konami is in making Genesis, a new format that's recently come out, a format specifically structured by and for a Western audience, showing a much more level-headed approach to game balance. But even with this breath of fresh air, the fact of the matter still remains. Yu-Gi-Oh! At its very core needs to change. Because Genesis isn't Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a form of it, and if you have to make different forms to wring out any enjoyment, you're only ignoring the truth. The game doesn't need to reset, it just has to acknowledge its flaws and take genuine action in resolving them effectively. Other than Genesis, Master Duel's events have made it very apparent they're directly aware of how certain cards harm gameplay. Yet, when it comes to running the core game, they will bury their heads in the sand and pretend like nothing's wrong. I'm not gonna mince words. Whoever is directly responsible for decisions made in running this game is genuinely failing it. When there are clear examples of knowing better, it becomes inarguable that they genuinely don't know what they're doing. So let's start by talking about the biggest elephant in the room. I'm sick of seeing archetypes be hated from frame one. I hate that every time I see a set of new cards, instead of thinking of the unique play style of the archetype or the themes in its artwork, I am immediately forced to grapple with the reality that the deck in question is going to be hated for a card that isn't even a part of its archetype. Being able to take advantage of an existing unhealthy card, and as a result, ensure their reputation will be filled with nothing but disdain. Oh, an archetype where all their monsters have different types? There can be only one deck. They all have the same type? Rivalry deck. All your monsters have different attributes? Goes in deck. All your monster effects don't even matter on field? Skill drain deck. A deck that doesn't care about its graveyard or actively interacts with the banishment? Shifter deck. And the thing is, I'm pretty sure Konami's well aware of this fact. Shifter is a card that most people with a pulse despise. Rightfully so. It is a card that only exists to remove a core component of the game in order to provide a massive imbalance in the favor of the few decks that can play it. However, it's not the only card in the game that's legal and does this. There's the literal opposite issue in a card like Lancia, along with plenty more. The reason this video isn't just about the ban list is because, to Konami, this is intentional. This is intended philosophy behind the game. It means they can sell new archetypes with the idea they can use these powerful pre-existing cards to compete. And while some of them have been limited, they haven't been removed entirely, choosing to keep them around in spite of knowing their impact on gameplay. In the long run, this was just awful for the card design space in general. Sure, Shifter may have very well given Malice an edge as a tiered strategy, but Lancia also hampered that tiered edge. Not as a means of checking it, but rather invalidating it entirely. Is it really necessary to leave these legal if they don't even balance the game? Floodgates only serve to highlight the absolute worst part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Fun for me, not for thee. These are cards that deliberately aim to change the entire axis of the game, intending to functionally disallow your opponent from playing the game entirely, all while you sit there completely unimpeded. The common argument is that they help far weaker decks actually have an edge in competing against meta decks. I get it. It feels good to actually be able to play your deck without a figurative gun pointed to your head at every step. But that comes at the cost of the gun no longer being figurative. However, this sentiment doesn't even matter, because good decks can play them as well. Since YCS Anaheim, Floodgates have become a hot topic of debate once again, because they've displayed what they actually represent for gameplay, non-games, creating scenarios where an actual game isn't played at all. A player simply wins off the back of a singular card that invalidates the opponent's entire strategy. This continues to happen because of Konami's refusal to acknowledge the fundamental problem behind these cards. Floodgates in eons past weren't typically as bad in the day because the game was much slower. Floodgates used to actually reflect the namesake. They prevented things from getting out of hand. Floodgates, even more often than not, had a drawback the player using them had to contend with as well, so you were most likely making a concession in using them. Now, of course, not all Floodgates were remotely fair, even back then, like Kaiser Coliseum. Oh, what fun. The point is that these cards fundamentally go against what the modern game is at a larger level. The passage of time has only made them far less tolerable in gameplay. Back when games would usually last more than 3 turns, there was a realistic chance that you could eventually draw the out and turn the tide of the duel, since your opponent couldn't vaporize you at a moment's notice. But now that duels tend to cap out at 2 to 3 turns, if you can't address them immediately, they translate to an instant game loss. This issue is compacted into being even worse in the context of a best of 3. The reason not to play Floodgates is because of variance. You never know for certain if they'll be effective against every deck you see, but if you load your side deck with them instead, you now have auto-win buttons for games 2 and 3, invalidating the entire point of playing a best of 3. The continued legality of these cards invalidate the game on a systematic level. As I've already highlighted, Floodgates usually tend to be a brand of shame for archetypes. The fact that they can use them without suffering any consequences means the deck is defined competitively by that card, a card that intends to invalidate gameplay as a whole. Having the identity of the archetype be impacted by these cards genuinely harms their reputation far more than it helps them. Less people focus on the genuine design behind the archetype and more so on the power and how it ends up being uncontested as a result of the floodgate that the deck skirts around. It actively sets back the ability to evaluate the strength of cards. This then seems to trickle back into design, since nothing is truly learned from people hating those archetypes rather than hating the genuine and competent design practices. This is sticking mostly to the conventionally applicable floodgates. There are a swath of far less conventional floodgates, but when they manage to rear their ugly heads, the issue remains the same. they create non-games. Paradise Smasher got banned because it only now started working. The reality is that its design was never indicative of healthy gameplay. It's just a matter of object permanence. Getting rid of it only once Konami sees it, because foresight is a foreign concept to Konami. There are plenty of cards that have followed this very cycle. It doesn't matter how niche they may be, they ultimately contribute nothing of value to gameplay health. Awarding an auto-win to any deck capable of using them is completely shallow design. Deck lockdown is just mistake, but it can also stop your opponent from summoning from the deck. The reason this card isn't super conventional is because it heavily affected both players. These are two extremely potent things to cut off, so doing the same to yourself typically didn't get you far either. Of course, you could just activate it after playing all of your cards, entirely invalidating the setback of the card. This just didn't see as much use as others because it's less applicable. But in the scenarios it was playable, no one, and I mean no one, would tell you it contributed to healthy back and forth gameplay. It doesn't matter how good or bad these floodgates are. The reality is that they actively invalidate gameplay as a whole, and if they aren't actually addressed, we're just going to needlessly go down a line of them every banlist cycle waiting for them to all die off. The very ideology behind floodgates is anachronistic. It's a question as to why do we still have them around if they aren't even appropriate for modern design standards. The simplest answer I can think of is that they're blanket solutions, structured to patch flaws with the game that Konami can't be bothered to genuinely fix. If you go by the logic that they're meant to give newer or casual players an easier barrier to entry and play, since they simplify games, well, I have news. That isn't addressing any of the actual barriers to entry. Even then, this doesn't work. Say, for example, I'm someone who plays the game casually. I decide I'm going to spend this limited time off work getting invested in one format. I commit to learning the meta, learning how to play a deck that I really want to play in the format. I've taken time aside to take the game seriously, because I like the game itself and have made a commitment with the freedom available to do so. Then what I'm greeted by in gameplay is cards that convince me the game isn't taking itself seriously. If I become disillusioned with the game, do you think I'm gonna keep buying product for it? Sure, maybe I could just call it quits on taking the game seriously. Go back to playing casually and investing less in products. But this game has a competitive scene. It has a world's competition for multiple different formats of the game. The existence of these cards hurt that scene. The scene that is responsible for your profit. Do you want to make money? If you want to appeal to casuals in gameplay, you have to establish a format that accomplishes that. Or, better yet, actually address the core game's philosophy woes so casual players can play a game of actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Without being overwhelmed. Why would anyone invest in a game that actively disincentivizes becoming invested in it? It's not going to make someone casual get invested in playing on and off. If anything, it's just going to make them disinterested from ever sticking to the game long term. Likely to just forget it and move on to another hobby. Is it really sustainable to rely on a market of people that never commit to your game over a market of people that are already committed no matter what? I feel like it's business 101 to operate for the benefit of an existing majority rather than a fictional minority at the expense of said majority. The only people that like floodgates have zero interest in engaging with gameplay. Every time I see someone mention liking them, their reasoning is, the game sucks. If the game sucks, don't play it. If this design appeals to people that don't want to play your game to begin with, don't design them. Why would anyone stick by a game that they can't take their enjoyment of seriously ever? It isn't going to make someone casual get invested. If anything, it's just going to make them disinterested from ever sticking to the game long term. Is it really sustainable to rely on a market of people that never commit to your game in the first place? I feel like it's business 101 to operate for the benefit of an existing majority rather than a fictional minority at the expense of said majority. Blanket solutions are never particularly good in philosophy, and they most certainly aren't in Yu-Gi-Oh! Take Nibiru and Mach for example. They're cards that exist as a deterrent to specialing a billion times. It's just a shame that specialing a billion times has become a key component of the game now. Nibiru is less of a problem, seeing as it does actually demand a semblance of thought to use correctly. Mach C, on the other hand, doesn't. This card functionally emulates another existing floodgate that's already banned, and as independent cards get stronger and stronger, the amount of drawing Mach C does gets less and less fair, contributing to a lose-lose scenario when it resolves. Mach C turns the use of every single extra deck mechanic in the game into pot of greed for your opponent, and decks aren't designed to end on a single use of a summoning mechanic. Hell, Ryzeal isn't even designed this way. Despite Detonator being such an independently insane card, passing on just it is not remotely respectable. Because if decks were able to reliably contest a 7-card hand with a single card, that would be an entirely different problem for game balance. Mach C is a card that invalidates 99% of the game's design. It actively invalidates the integrity of the game itself. This is not a card that balances the game. It is a card that imbalances it entirely. It is the card game equivalent of Brawl's tripping mechanic, where if it goes through, the actual competitive edge is lost completely. Although Nibiru isn't as potent a floodgate as Mach C, as time goes on, it feels more and more like one. The very same thing that happened to Mach C. The existence of this card does nothing more than guarantee that any deck that doesn't have an answer to it before 5 summons is unplayable on a competitive level. Of course, the alternative to not losing to Nibiru is making said deck insanely resilient to being Nibiru'd. We've seen how that's not exactly the easiest solution to crack either. Just think about Sword Soul and how Barone was more about insulation against Nibiru rather than about being an endboard piece. Ryzeal Cross being insulation against Nibiru. Decks making Apo before the 5th summon to, you guessed it, insulate against Nibiru. This is a paradoxical Ouroboros effect on game design. They want this card to exist to keep a type of deck in check that does not exist on a wider scale, with them also allowing cards that invalidate its very purpose to begin with. Instead of balancing the game's health on a broader scale, like it purports to, it is keeping a large demographic of decks that aren't even particularly good out of playability, even on a more casual level. It's duplicitous design. More decks are designed to lose to Nibiru than there are decks designed with the capacity to play around it. Decks will do 5 or more summons and achieve precious little in that time. It's a wonder as to why decks are designed this way. It makes them needlessly convoluted for the person playing it, and it makes it automatically lose to cards like Nibiru or Mach C, regardless of the archetype's actual power level or gameplay style. It is setting archetypes up for failure. Why would you knowingly design cards in such a way that makes them not worth playing? The excessive summoning serves as checkpoints of interaction, and yet the game on a broader scale isn't utilizing those individual checkpoints. It's just blowing them out entirely at the starting line or the end goal. In a series where I make new archetypal support for fun, for Evil Twin, the first thing I literally had to account for is designing an in-archetype way around Nibiru, so the deck can actually play the game, without needing Sprite of course. Evil Twin is an archetype that originally intended to end on a single pop while drawing a card. This unimpressive game plan is completely invalidated by the existence of Nibiru, because they designed the deck to get there at 5 summons. So if the deck were to be playable, support has to address this, and not actually expand on the deck's game plan, because it doesn't matter if it expands if it's still going to pan out the same way in gameplay. They printed Trouble Sunny, which made the duo much better, but the deck still had the same flaw. There's no answer to Nibiru, it's just a 6th summon. This means anytime Konami wants to design a tiered strategy, they have to warp the design around all these cards so that they can actually sell them. Konami made further support for the twins with a new main deck name and a link one. There was a short fanfare for the support, and then the deck faded back into the shadows, because they added more gas to a car with no tires. Sweet sounds like it addresses the Nibiru problem, but because she only negates a card that's activated in response, and to a live twin card, the subsect of the archetype that's irrelevant past summon 1, it's extremely easy to still rinse the deck with a Nibiru. While it does address the deck's weakness to other hand traps, it doesn't address the one that automatically wins against them. But they're well aware of this issue in design. They made a DDD card that couldn't be more transparent about its purpose, letting the deck skip the Nibiru tax so it actually has the capacity to play games. This isn't good for the general design space of the game. It's as though Konami are aware Nibiru's existence just invalidates decks that aren't even that powerful to begin with. So to combat this fact, we just design ways to negate it. We can't just ban Nibiru, that would mean Dark World Hand Loop FTK would be playable. Just ignore the fact we willfully printed an FTK. This all ties into a greater issue with the game as a whole. The absurd power level of the game and the sheer refusal to directly address it. The ban list is how you remove the poison from the well that is Yu-Gi-Oh's card pool. However, Konami seems to have this impression that by dumping different poison in the well, that they can eliminate the other toxic substances. While you may not be averse to the poison they dump now, the continued use of this methodology will eventually lead to a well poisoned to a point that there will be no one left that can drink from it. This belief has spawned from the idea that banning one or two cards isn't going to fix what is a widespread problem, but resigning to do nothing is actively worse. This current approach is a non-solution, which continues to lead to non-games. The continued card design of summoning a bunch of guys doesn't need to be common design. Cards that invalidate that sort of play don't need to exist either. The game doesn't need to reset its power level, it needs a damn grip on it. Too much of modern design philosophy is built on an Ouroboros principle, hoping that they cancel each other out. There's no dynamic scenario born from this approach. There's only one side that consumes the other. It's entirely artificial. It isn't fun, it isn't interesting, it's just dull. It's not gameplay, it's the complete and utter erasure of it. Dimensional Barrier is one of the worst cases of this mindset. It is a card that literally disallows your opponent from using a specific summoning mechanic, save for Links, which is only the case because the card was printed before them. Honestly, I'm surprised they haven't eroded it to include Links. With how little regard they have for gameplay, might as well go the whole 9 yards. So many decks are straight up designed to use only one summoning mechanic. So D-Barrier is an auto win against a majority of the decks in the game. This card's playability only serves as an embarrassment to the integrity of running the game, willfully allowing a card that not only consistently sees play, but also consistently ruins gameplay. The fact it took this long to finally get rid of it in any format is a stain of incompetency. But this isn't the worst case of it somehow. Mach is an indefensible card. If you defend it, you are quite literally the problem to this game. Mach is a scam. Its existence is the equivalent of a restaurant selling you poison food and an antidote to the poison separately. But instead of rightfully condemning them for knowingly poisoning your food, you commend them for also selling an antidote. You're a sucker. It only justifies the continual cycle of the god-awful card design that it's meant to deter. The thing you want out of the game, instead of actually forcing them to design cards to be healthy and balanced in the first place. Hypothetical cards should not be a deterrent to poor design. Intrinsic gameplay ramifications should. The moment I became fully cognizant of how terribly designed Mach is was when I won off of it. It felt satisfying to be able to have the ability to actually contest my opponent, but when it set in that I had to go +4 to even stand a chance, I just got depressed. I actually care about winning playing my deck and outskilling my opponent with it, not winning because of abysmal game balance. I want the deck that I'm playing to be competent enough to compete, rather than rely on random chance to break the game's balance in my favor. Mach only attempts to flip it in the other's favor. It's awful design from every angle and should never be legal in any capacity of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! All it serves as is an excuse to perpetuate bad design habits. And if you actually want them to go away, this stain has to go with it. This game, as it is now, is built on the principle of mutually assured destruction. Konami just refuses to acknowledge that philosophy doesn't work in the context of a card game. Just because you and I both have nuclear weaponry doesn't mean we're not gonna drop it on each other. In fact, if I drop it on you, unlike its real-world ramifications, you have to wait until after the bombs drop to respond. I think you can understand why that isn't exactly good game balance. Earlier, I mentioned the relation of Shifter and Lancia. These two provide another avenue towards non-games. Shifter is able to shut out decks that rely on the grave from playing completely, allowing you to curb stomp any graveyard-dependent archetype into oblivion. The graveyard is an important resource that most decks use, so a card like Shifter being around to invalidate those is just bad for the game's health. Lancia is just the reverse of Shifter, entirely invalidating banish-centric decks, allowing you to curb stomp those decks. So we had a point in the game where Malice precipitated the cycle of both to create non-games, being a Shifter deck that actively relied on banishing their cards, making it so they would also auto-lose to Lancia. This isn't a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's go fish. Whoever drops the nuke first wins. Counters shouldn't be silver bullets that kill on the spot. This philosophy only creates non-games in the opposite direction, which is still a non-game of Yu-Gi-Oh! There are so many cards legal in the game that do this, and Konami refuses to remove them unless they can't keep ignoring them. Any genuine competition is meant to be more like a boxing match, going blow for blow against one another, with each blow and guard building up to a back and forth. One that doesn't determine the outcome all at once. But at some point we started bringing weapons into the ring. Bats, then blades, then guns, and now full-on nukes. And because we're on a nuclear level, these sorts of floodgates are far more potent than they've ever been. But instead of addressing this absurd power escalation, it only ensures one player is susceptible to it. This isn't solving the issue of the game. It's only making it more apparent. But of course, floodgates aren't the only problem with card design and the game's philosophy. They're just one of many blanket solutions that Konami's trying to peddle as balance. Hand traps are another facet of modern-day card design. At some point, they became a prevalent part of the game. They're not officially called hand traps, it's simply a term that the player base coined. Konami themselves not applying a moniker to these cards leads me to believe they're just like any other monster in the game to them, despite knowing full well they're not. While the idea of hand traps existed since the beginning, it wasn't really until Ash where the design philosophy became apparent as a way to curb the game's power level on a broader scale. With searching becoming more common in the game than breathing, there had to be a card to curb it from getting out of hand. With so many powerful cards in general, something like Ghost Ogre also made sense, being a way to pump cards that activate on field. This principle behind them is fine on paper, and usually in practice, since you were effectively trading a card from your hand in order to weaken your opponent's plays. There are a lot of people that kick and scream at the existence of hand traps in general, but they make perfect sense. However, as they'd print more and more hand traps, the more and more cards that play through all of them would need to exist, once again creating an Ouroboros dichotomy around the game, making them go from a way to curb a deck's end board to a means of turning the game into solitaire, either ending your opponent's turn or losing the game for not stopping your opponent from playing the game. It's in part why one-card combos are so prevalent in modern card design, because if you get ashed, the deck still has to do something, which means other independent cards have to be just as impactful, which then means you have to be playing more hand traps with more potent effects to still prevent them from executing a game-winning combo, creating this volatile Ouroboros dichotomy to the game. There's very little nuance actually employed in balancing these two sides. Ghost Ogre is a card that doesn't see consistent play, and that's because it's not nearly as generically good as most other hand traps. The overabundance of hand traps paired with the game's design landscape has only encouraged playing more of these cards rather than less of them, entirely nullifying the initial balance that they had. You don't care if you spend half your hand on stopping your opponent, because the other half of your hand will just as easily snowball into a dozen cards capable of closing the game out. As time has gone on, more and more cards have begun to search 2 cards instead of 1. Early on, these used to cost you another card in hand, making them the biggest ash magnet on the planet, actively making them unappealing to play. While your opponent won't always have ash, you will always lose to it every time they do see it. And since ash is a core part of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, you will see it, and you'll lose to it when you do. So now we're at the point where we can search 2 cards without discarding, making the scenarios where you get ashed less devastating. This highlights the obvious problem in following this philosophy in design. Just because ash and the other hand traps exist does not mean you're always going to open all the cards you need to balance the game, meaning a deck skipping the ash tax can suddenly become a game-winning difference. Relying on an unreliable means of balancing the game is an incredibly stupid balancing measure on its face. Adding more cards to artificially make it reliable still doesn't make it a reliable balance. It just makes it a gameplay nuisance that will perform its intended purpose sometimes, while setting gameplay back most of the time. Hand traps are all fine in a vacuum. They don't break the game in half simply by existing, but it's getting to the point where it's a problem. Despite the prevalence of Ashe as a card, even it ends up as a format-dependent card. And it's genuinely a bad thing if she's not in the format. Ashe is the most ubiquitous type of disruption in the game, so when it's suddenly not good, it's a sign far worse things are taking place in gameplay. Ashe may not be in the average list, but a billion other format-specific hand traps will be, and they're not going to contribute to any healthier of a gameplay environment. This often leaves deck building in a miserable place, where half to even 2/3 of a deck are hand traps, and the scraps of it is the actual core of the archetype itself, and maybe another engine. It's endemic of the game's undertuned balance between consistency and power, and how the reliance on hand traps can devolve the game into solitaire. You either match card for card, or you lose. It isn't genuinely skill testing, and it certainly isn't engaging gameplay. If an archetype can't play through them, they're naturally far worse. Not even because of their innate power level or their playstyle, but because they don't have one-card combos to afford them the ability to run so many hand traps. Playing so many hand traps runs you the risk of seeing hands like this. Because hand traps aren't productive card design, and their inclusion is a necessity for the modern landscape, this demands engine cards with hyper-productive design. Otherwise, they can neither halt the opponent nor progress their own plays, reflecting the Ouroboros effect that one-card combos has on archetypes without them, creating a damned if you do and damned if you don't scenario. If a deck does a lot of searching as its primary gameplay loop, and you don't draw Ashe, well, I have just the card for you. I hope you didn't want to use the game mechanic in the game that's entirely dependent on searching en masse. Droll has been cited as being a canary in a coal mine for certain formats, a phraseology that means nothing considering the 50 other canaries that are already dead. Droll is a card that also takes us back to Shifter and Lancia. All of them are lingering floodgates. These are the absolute worst type of hand traps, since there is no way to counter them once they resolve. If we're assuming floodgates were genuinely intended to balance the game out, they also fall under this issue of reliability, since you still have to draw them, and worst of all, you have to be going first to even use them effectively. Fat load of good these'll do you if your opponent's going first. So now we've printed them on hand traps instead, compounding the issues of both philosophies into one even bigger issue that, once again, fails to balance the game earnestly. This isn't a case of Jenga. The entire infrastructure doesn't collapse once they're removed. The infrastructure collapses once they become an integral part of the game's ecosystem, because they're designed to do something they can't possibly do. They need to be removed as a necessary part of the structure, and the game itself needs to address and reform around the changes proper. Droll just validates the design behind cards that search too, which then creates an Ouroboros effect, needing Ashe and Droll to stop the cards that are only designed this way as a direct result of these cards being too prevalent in the game's ecosystem, leaving the game to actively consume itself, something it can't do. This then further validates design creep in general. How do you get around cards like Droll or Ashe that can choke out decks at times? Simple, by printing searches that don't add to hand. Just skip that part and set it to the field. Cards that set directly to field feel deliberately designed to get around this. While cards like this already existed, it's become increasingly common in modern design, and while applications like Centurion leverage it in a way beyond just dodging Ashe and Droll, it feels pretty clear the real goal behind the design is skirting around them. When you consider the most prominent case of this was with Diabellstar, it seems pretty deliberate. And if this design becomes more common, Ashe and Droll become worse. But the continued design of cards depends on them to exist to balance the game. So I'd hope this doesn't replace searching, since there is more nuance to this design than just dodging Ashe and Droll. Because they decided a card that makes you lose on the spot would justify making these design choices in the first place. The fact that lingering floodgate hand traps are legal is extremely bad. The fact that there are decks designed in such a way that the cards feel like they're at times a necessary evil is also very bad. It, among many silver bullet hand traps, have a tendency to outright ruin formats that would otherwise be considered perfect. You have people that believe a best of one format defeats that problem. it doesn't. Because the reality is, the ban list itself has to reflect the game's balance, best of 1 or best of 3, and as evidenced by Konami running both, they can't balance for either. These cards exist to deter something that the actual game's balance itself should have been deterring from the start. Their intended use is in a scenario that should have never been allowed to occur in the first place. They create non-games, and these are the cards that never get hit for good. Instead, it is the current top deck that plays them. Another deck will eventually come along and play them. The same gameplay issues will persist, just the deck that plays them will change. The fundamental problem that people hate will never go away, but the very things people actually enjoy will. It's a toxic model that provides nothing of value to anyone. To round out this segment on hand traps, we have to talk about the Called By dilemma. Called By is actually a card I like, but because of the role it ends up serving in the game's existing ecosystem, a majority of people hate the card and want it banned, for good reason. It's yet another example of the Ouroboros design philosophy employed by the game. I like Called By because it's a far more potent DD Crow, with the caveat that it isn't a hand trap you can fire whenever, while negating the card it banishes in the process. The card has plenty of versatile use, banishing a card that activates Engrave, or banishing a card your opponent's targeting Engrave for an effect, with the banishing of it causing their card to resolve without effect. There's a dynamic to knowing when to use the card and what to use it for, either preemptively or reactively. It's something that depends entirely on the dynamic nature of a game state. There's an actual element of depth to its use. However, these uses aren't the prominent application of the card. Because of how most hand traps work, they discard themselves for cost. This allows you to Called By said hand trap to negate it, and since the game has an over-reliance on these hand traps balancing the game, Called By ends up being a card that just invalidates one of them in practice. It's less about how the card is a versatile piece of graveyard disruption, and more about how you can play a card that just insulates you against the majority of hand traps. The design of the card becomes shallow because of the ecosystem the game perpetuates, leading it to further contribute to the non-game hand trap wars that plague the game. It certainly doesn't help that the negate lasts for 2 turns, and it's not a once per turn. Oops! While it affects both players to potentially cut you off from using the hand trap yourself, this balancing restriction actually makes it toxic in its other application, since banishing a key playmaker card for an archetype with Called By is just a death sentence. As someone that doesn't like Sky Striker, even I think it's diabolical that you can just banish Ray and basically win the game. In the context of Master Duel in the OCG, Called By's existence is a necessary evil. Because Mach exists and invalidates games entirely, you need to be playing a full suite of Called By and Ash. Then, of course, you also have to be playing it yourself, and now you gotta play Foolos, which is just 3 more copies of Mach. Since there are 2 different Machs and you're playing both, you might as well play Cross out too. Then don't forget any other staple hand traps like Imperm and format targets like Droll or Nibiru. Congratulations! Now that you've balanced the game, because Konami can't, you can now build a 20-card deck. If I wanted to play a 20-card deck, I'd play Duel Links. Why would you do this to me? Modern Yu-Gi-Oh's only really played when both players managed to survive the nuclear fallout, when all of the cards responsible for the absurd power level and balance of the game are spent, with the game state actually pertaining to the unique design of archetypes in the deck, where decision-making on both sides feels far more defined, leading to an abundance of genuine back-and-forth exchanges, instead of a one-sided flipping of the table on the other. Of course, like mentioned with the existence of hand traps, just because this is the case doesn't mean it's the norm. Very rarely will you see either side survive nuclear winter, let alone both. It's not adequate for the game's balance because it relies on something unreliable to ultimately balance the game. Even if you believe in the farcical notion that a card like Mach fixes the game, it doesn't, because it isn't present 100% of the time that it's supposed to be, and is present 100% of the time when it's not supposed to be. If it were to genuinely balance the game, it would need to be a Duel Link skill in real life, and at that point, it's clear there's a fundamental problem. Sometimes it truly feels like 90% of games aren't games of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but rather a scenario where both you and your opponent are fighting the game's balance in order to try and get to a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And most of the time, you never do. The The philosophy of combo is a problem in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The nature of modern combos design demands hand traps be present. Many times when a new set of cards is revealed, we'll then see an insane combo that builds a mountain of advantage, all with the activation of a singular card. Something that doesn't remotely reflect well on game balance. But it's okay because a single hand trap stops it from happening. But as I said, you can't rely on drawing a specific card to stop this. And even if you could, why would you choose to design cards when you don't want their effects to hamper gameplay on a regular basis? Modern Combo's gameplay is less like a string of actions taken based on player understanding of the game state or the deck itself, but rather how well you can recollect a spreadsheet, leaving the playstyle to solely feel like a predetermined linear process, with excessive tedium thrown in to mask its shallow depth. Combo wasn't always like this on a fundamental level, and that's because Combo as a playstyle, like most things in the game, have been streamlined to a point of losing its identity, leading to the infamous no-joke 30-minute turns with very little regard for actual design balance. Modern combo decks really just feel like archetypes designed to mindlessly spin a wheel for an excessive amount of time, with the act of doing so being the reward for playing them, rather than any genuine gameplay nuance. It's shallow and shows a clear lack of respect for player intelligence and, more pressingly, time. Combos going on creates long periods of waiting. Since turns can go up for upwards well past 10 minutes, with multiple cards activating and resolving, it makes the game's flow noticeably bloated. Something people neglect is the fact that reading and reading comprehension are two separate skills. Just because you can read a card does not mean your brain is going to fully digest what you just read. You're not likely to grasp the full depth of each individual card the moment you read them. There's archetypal context which you're likely lacking, and despite seeing multiple cards, it's not always obvious to intuit what cards are intending to do. I can read Poplar in under a minute, but that doesn't mean I'm going to comprehend the full extent of what Poplar does in a single read-over. Poplar has 3 separate effects, something that's become increasingly common in modern card design. Poplar's first effect is to special summon itself when added to hand by an effect. This gives you the implication the deck can add Poplar to hand, something that's not really shocking. This means knowing about Ash without necessarily knowing Ash exists, as well as Bonfire, which can get Poplar without using up your normal. Of course, then you have to know about 1-for-1, which can summon out Ash and also get you into Poplar without spending your normal. Then you have to think of any other card that could possibly achieve this as well. Then we have Poplar's second effect to add an archetypal spell trap, which means you need to know every spell trap that it can search. At least, that's assuming they're all worth playing, which may very well be a factor as to why some cards end up being unplayable. But of course you have to realize the direct correlation between these two effects, how the deck is aiming to summon this out without normaling to then perform this search. Then there's Poplar's third effect, placing a card in the spell and trap zone if it's sent to grave. This makes you aware of the archetype's gimmick of placing monsters in the spell trap zone, leaving you to wonder what and how the deck intends to interact with this design. Is it just a resource for another card? Is it to achieve some sort of unique game plan through other cards in the deck? Should I be worried about more cards being put in the spell and trap zone? Is that gonna happen to me? All of this is something you're forced to wrestle with by a singular card. While other cards can carry a lighter load of the archetype's design, cramming so much of it into one card is just overwhelming on face. And when you consider how it's quite literally scratching the surface of learning a deck, there's a serious problem. But most egregious of all is the formatting. Having a ton of effects crammed onto one card is much harder to digest when they're all vomited into a single compact paragraph. And unfortunately, formatting cards to be readable is exclusive to certain effects and not the standard design structure. The biggest advantage rogue decks have is that they're relatively unknown due to their lesser general play, with their design a lot of the time relying on your opponent not understanding how they work. But when they're combo decks, this is made into a genuine issue. Since multiple cards are fired off, you need not only read the 3 paragraphs crammed into each card in 4-point font, you need to also understand each and every part of the combo to know the best choke point. Then you need to know each and every endboard piece and how to best deal with them, either before they hit the field or after, knowing what every single card does and builds up to. This is all doable for the person playing the deck. They have forever before sitting down to play the combo deck to study and learn these. But once you're pitted against a combo deck, you're put in an unreasonable situation where you also have to grind the game to a halt if you want to actually do your best to play against them. But that's assuming you even can, since a lot of combo decks nowadays are designed to just create non-games with their end board, simply rewarding the combo player for putting in the time since they win for their efforts, while subsequently wasting the opponent's time since they sat through a game they never could have played to begin with. This type of design has only been normalized because when these type of decks are meta, you're forced to learn them ahead of time. Players typically do learn them regardless because that's the natural approach to metas. But the reality is, modern combo design hiding behind that fact is actively bad for the game. It's design that compounds every one of Yu-Gi-Oh's worst design principles into one undesirable package. And to have it passed off as just being a deck you have to learn like every other meta deck ignores the clear lack of regard that it has for design balance in general. As mentioned earlier, Nibiru is meant to circumvent combo decks from getting out of hand. But as the game is now, every deck that doesn't set 5 and pass is susceptible to it. Nibiru is like Maxi in the way that the thing it counters has gradually become the norm rather than an egregious outlier. Nibiru needs to go, and so does the design that it's meant to keep in check. There needs to be a better inherent cap and legitimate punishment to decks that do too much summoning. As Nibiru exists in the game currently, it doesn't serve to deter you from summoning too much. It only encourages creating a negate in less than 5 summons in the event it even is in play. There's little thought put into designing archetypes to be able to play around it. You either lose to it, or win because your opponent didn't see it, creating an arbitrary qualification for being tiered, rather than leaving it to tangible factors like general power level. This brings us to the fact of the matter. If Konami clearly doesn't want modern combos design to be a widespread problem, they could just stop designing combo decks in this way. You're designing a deck to lose to a card, so people aren't as frustrated with that deck, when you could have just designed it to not be frustrating in the first place. If a card like Nibiru is to punish degenerate combo, stop designing every deck to be degenerate. If the checkpoints are so inconsequential, don't arbitrarily space them out so entire strategies are invalidated by the existence of Nibiru. It just turns Nibiru into an arbitrary gatekeeper, not a genuine balancing measure. While Ryzeal is a far less egregious type of combo deck in gameplay that actually mitigates some design balance concerns, it's an archetype that just summons a ton of guys with relatively no setbacks, to then search out and summon far more bodies. It's insane value for little investment. Fiendsmith also had this element to it, where being able to get to Requiem without using your normal provided obscene value for no real cost, making it so you can just play a ton of low investment engines, creating another issue. There are decks that fold to their normal summon being hit with an interruption. This is frustrating and poor design in the game in general, ironically being on the scale of making decks far too weak. But designing cards in this way doesn't really aim to resolve that issue, because these aren't for the archetypes that struggle with this. Designing cards like these so loosely creates another dangerous issue with combo, as you can now slap these sort of engines into already egregious combo decks. You can't really design cards like these without more focused design around them, because they'll just end up causing issues like Fiendsmith and Mitsurugi have. While Fiendsmith has somewhat rusted away due to a certain factor, despite being a ritual archetype, Mitsurugi is caught on as being extremely splashable. This is because Habakiri gives you full Mitsurugi combo without spending your normal. While they banned King of the Feral Imps to curb this, Habakiri is a ritual, and there's a multitude of ways to search a ritual monster. This type of design devalues these archetypes as genuine strategies and simply turns them into nothing more than engines begging to be abused. They don't necessarily need locks. Ryzeal even has one, and it barely matters. They need better design context, making them far less generic in direction, because if they're too generic, then every single deck under the sun becomes a combo deck. If the combo doesn't provide something meaningful outside of a specific context, there's no reason to include it everywhere. That's basic design balance 101, but it seems like Konami don't really care to take note of that fact. This is a problem that can be fine-tuned on paper. It's just a matter of actually doing so. What isn't really something that can be fine-tuned is the game's obsession with negates as a hard solution. So many decks will be designed with at least one negate, especially combo decks. I wonder why they could possibly need that, and those that aren't designed with them are either worse off or designed with the capacity to get to generic ones. Negates are what could be classified as anti-interaction. Interaction aims to do something dynamic to the game state. Your opponent activates an effect, and you blow up their monster. The effect still resolves, and they're still capable of playing, but losing the body maybe sets them back. Or maybe they're playing a deck like Fire King, so a pop is actively bad. If you have non-destruction removal available, you can use it to out their monster without triggering said effect. But such removal is hard to come by, so you have to know when to best use it, whereas negation simply flat out prevents anything from happening. Instead of encouraging dynamic interactions between your own cards and your opponents, you're just aiming to prevent them from playing the game, full stop. It isn't interesting mechanically. It only serves as blanket protection, and when there are so many blanket threats in the game, it only encourages endboards with blanket solutions to them. Then, when those aren't even present, it leads to lopsided gameplay. Generic negates should not be in the game as they limit gameplay as a whole, but because there are so many unbalanced game-winning cards, negates feel like a necessary evil that typically ends up being unnecessary. Ghost Ogre is a format-dependent hand trap because A, popping a card that has to be on field, then activate its effect afterwards is slow. And B, since it doesn't negate the thing it destroys, it ends up being a pretty low-impact hand trap. This is printed on a hand trap, a card type that is extremely easy to use. The fact that a card like this is considered bad highlights an issue. The fact that this level of nuance and design is obsolete, because if it doesn't negate the thing, it's not really doing anything to balance the game out. Pendulum is an entire card type that has had its reputation defined by combo and negates. The reason why most people hate Pendulum gameplay is because Konami refuses to design them with competent endboard pieces that are unique to their design. They leave them to just pump out a million negates. There's nothing else they can do for interactions, because they didn't bother to give them any. Pendulum extra deck monsters exist as a card type, and yet they remain unutilized as tools for Pendulum decks. They have an easy way to start curbing generic tools for Pendulum, they're just not doing it. This isn't a problem exclusive to Pendulum, yet I feel as though Pendulum has been used as a scapegoat to ignore the fact this design permeates the game as a whole. There's this misconception that open-ended design is inherently good, whereas linearity is inherently bad. Open-ended gameplay is always good, as it's adaptive and tests your on-the-fly decision-making. However, most open-ended decks aren't actually open-ended. The issue is in people conflating aimless with open-ended. They create the illusion that no two games are the same. Games can follow many different roads, but in actuality, regardless of the path you take, you reach the same destination every time. The end goal is always the same, preventing your opponent from playing the game. It's just the path that varies. The very same philosophy as Floodgates, but it wastes even more of your time to do so. There are so many decks that can do anything with all of their resources except find a genuine win condition. It's aimless design masquerading as open-ended. In some respects, this is in part to account for archetypes that Konami just doesn't care about supporting directly anymore. I wouldn't call that satisfactory for anyone that actually likes those decks. Not to mention, this generic design isn't only used by those that Konami forgot. Konami has to actually reflect on the design of cards like the Cyberse monster type and Snake Eyes. These could play through Nibiru by just not having a good choke point. If they don't want Nibiru to be a game-endingly strong card, you still have to figure out a way to balance the average deck's general power level. And surprise, surprise, making a deck that can just combo through Nibiru isn't exactly easy to balance out with all of these broken generic cards. Circular and Poplar are cards that do everything for their decks, and in the case of Circular, everything for their monster type. While I do like the aspect of Poplar that it's still a good normal summon, the overall design context around it makes it so that fact contributes to the card feeling absurdly broken, rather than being neatly versatile. These are one-card combos that exist as such because they have to adapt to the climate of so many hand traps. But the existence of these cards also encourages deck building to include more hand traps to stop them. Circular is a single card that snowballs in a massive card advantage by itself. It's the only card in the game to invalidate Small World's harsh cost. It and Poplar have become the poster children of one-card combos, and we still see more offenders being printed. I despise this. What is the combo? It's a single card doing all the work. There are other cards involved physically, but it's very evident in gameplay that only one of them is responsible for all of them being put into play. It's not a combo between cards so much as it's a dissertation that's been divided into multiple pieces of cardboard. It devalues all of the associated cards by forcing out any chance of them doing something beyond the linear combo. They're deprived of any dynamism. There's nothing dynamic for the cards to do other than follow the specific combo. It's rooted in the idea of making them good in the context of the one-card combo, rather than being good in actual gameplay. One-card combos becoming more common in the game then demands you play more hand traps in order for you to be able to play the game, since if you don't stop all of them, you won't get to play the game due to the atrocious balance behind them. But if you draw too many hand traps, you still don't get to play the game, because they're not productive cards. This then further demands you have a one-card combo present in your deck, so you can play the game. It is the epitome of an Ouroboros effect on the game's design as a whole, attempting to consume everything, even itself. This nature and design was especially bad with Circular, as the card was banned. You know why it was banned but Poplar wasn't? I'll give you a hint. This is where we get into a separate issue that's a subsect of combo, something I intend to expand on in greater depth with a different video. But it's also relevant here. Cyberse as a monster type is shallow, not in number, but in depth. It's an entire monster type that's constrained to the combo playstyle, designing so many to get more bodies in circulation. Who would have thought designing an entire monster type around links and printing one of the strongest generic links under that typing wasn't exactly a well thought out idea? But don't worry, we want to sell a new Cyberse archetype, so Circular's free again. The design space for Cyberse archetypes is limited to just being a link spam combo deck. Malice, even while trying to be somewhat interesting with it, failed. I bring up the Cyberse issue because I saw Malice and was excited for its theming. Then, when they revealed it was a banishment-oriented Cyberse deck, I could tell it was going to be hated by everyone under the sun, because both those elements are despicable traits in the game's design ecosystem. Malice's cool design principles with their traps and banishment recursion are completely overshadowed by all the awful design bureaucracy that Konami refuses to address. We can never see a Cyberse archetype and think, wow. Instead, we're left with, wow, more combo slop. Great. The only archetypes that have managed to break from Cyberse's slop mold are Salamangreat and Morenses. And that's because they just designed links that facilitate their own game plan instead, which then in turn dictates that they combo off. Even if they're more courteous in design, it shows how shallow the entire monster type is. The fact remains, they have to make every Cyberse archetype link-oriented. Otherwise, it won't follow whatever game plan they intended for the archetype originally, since you'll just use all of the generic link climbing slop. One-card combos and links cannot coexist without thorough restrictions. You either lock them out of generic links, or don't design them in the first place. The fact Malice link locks is the most embarrassing line of text ever printed on a card. Oh no! I can only use the most generic and accessible mechanic in the game? Woe is me. Links are already an underbalanced mechanic in the game. Designing cards that just vomit out a million guys without serious restriction ensures that any and all powerful generics will be abused. It deprives decks of their unique gameplay identity and the game of fun. Yubel's close to being a deck I love. I love the reflect damage as a fully realized game plan. I love that Yubel actually got made into a coherent functional archetype. I both love and hate that they miss timing as a sort of unintended future-proofing to curb link climbing in the deck. I appreciate that they've made a card that negates without actually being a negate. It's just that it's still a negate functionally. And it's way too easy to make while also not being a once per turn summon that can be summoned using itself. It should have added the effect to pop rather than replace it entirely. It's close to good design in that regard. Of course, the elephant in the room is that Yubel has so many cards that make it absurdly strong, with an overabundance of one-card combos leading to an overabundance of hand traps necessary to counter it in turn. Not to mention, Fiendsmith exists as a low-investment powerful engine with its own fair share of one-card combos, making the deck even more powerful, creating a scenario where you either hose them with hand traps or lose. I really like how Yubel and Unchained came together with their synergistic design, but Fiendsmith, in conjunction with the amount of monster spam already capable, blurred the deck into just being a fiend pile, putting it way over the edge in acceptable design. I feel it's worth reminding you, Yubel's intended payoff was using Super Poly, a card that people want banned, for you to make a boss monster that could eat your opponent's entire board, and it wasn't even good enough to be played in the deck. Instead, there's a generic rank 10 negate that would make better use of that extra deck slot. Wonderful. With all these compounding issues behind the game's philosophy, it's time to discuss where it all comes to a head, where the negative impact is felt most clearly. As I've outlined, combo gameplay, if it goes off, results in a problem for the player going second, creating an unbreakable board that essentially invalidates player 2's input in general. This is the true culmination of everything. One of the biggest issues in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the massive disparity between going first and going second. If you're going second, you usually don't get the chance to play, unless you've sufficiently hand-trapped your opponent. Hand-traps are truly a necessity for the context of going second, not solely for combo, but in general, just so you actually have a chance to play the game at all. Hand traps suck for going first gameplay, but are necessary because you can't always go first, obviously. Even if they aren't productive to your game plan, even if they rot in your hand, you need to play them. Because a world where you don't means you'll play far less games of Yu-Gi-Oh! But just because they inhibit the player going first doesn't actually change anything. There's just a chance you don't play Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of a bricked hand with too many of them. There are a few other ways that address going second, and none of them are truly effective solutions either. Board breakers are the most prevalent alternative to hand traps. These are cards that, once again, attempt to address the game's horrible imbalance by simply swinging it the other way. Your opponent made a billion negates? Dark Ruler no more. Problem solved. Did they have a ton of monsters? Raigeki. Did they set 5 and pass? Duster. Want a hybrid choice of Raigeki and Duster? Lightning Storm. Want both effects in one? Evenly. Banish the board save for one card. Opponent has scary monsters? Super Poly. All gone, and they can't respond. Your opponent has a monster that functionally can't be outed? Kaiju. Once again, a series of cards that exist to address things that never should have been a problem in the first place. This design premise often ends up resulting in non-games where the person going first gets blown out regardless of what they did. Then, should they survive because of cards like Dark Ruler and Evenly, that stipulations are that you can't outright kill your opponent that turn. It justifies one-card combos further, because how else are you going to have a chance to come back against these blowouts? It alludes to back-and-forth gameplay, but it ends up a shallow bastardization of it. You and I both know a one-card combo snowballs into another nuke, which is the biggest issue behind their design. They're not intended to perform a combo in the true sense. They're just meant to win the game should they resolve unimpeded. Because of how difficult it is to break modern boards, these sorts of auto wins serve as a means of preventing that issue coming to a head in gameplay. But of course, it doesn't shift the game to a healthier state so much as it shifts the result of the die roll. There's no winning with this type of design. It doesn't improve going second, it just invalidates going first. For the game's design to support these sorts of cards being fine, the average archetype would have to have layered interactions. But Konami refuses to design the average archetype in a way that accounts for that. Like with Nibiru, they write a blueprint for healthier design, then proceed to never follow it. Of course, these cards being posed as a solution to game balance holds the same exact problem that the reliance on hand traps does. Just like hand traps, they also rely on you drawing them under the specific scenario where you need them. But unlike hand traps, they're even more useless in scenarios where you don't need them. Relying on chance to balance the game doesn't work on a fundamental level, and relying on these cards to resolve another issue isn't helping. Pendulum highlights just how ineffective both philosophies are as an absolute rule. Because of the nature of Pendulum, you want pendulums en masse. Otherwise, the deck doesn't do anything, assuming it was designed to even do something in the first place. Spending 2 cards from hand just to use the mechanic against any established board in the game, save for Viacroid, is a recipe for failure. The design is already at conflict with card economy and the EMZ rules. Their inability to effectively wield either makes the mechanic legitimately impossible to play going second. This entire card type is defunct, not even because the mechanic itself was gutted, but because these two philosophies in balancing the game don't work in conjunction with Pendulum's design. This is a problem on a micro level with archetypes as well, but the fact that an entire summoning mechanic is rendered unusable as a result of this should ring alarm bells. especially when the only functional way to play Pendulum is going first and just barfing out generic endboard pieces and/or negates. This issue of depending on these philosophies also extends to trap decks, because just like Pendulum, the passage of time has been harsh to their functionality. So adding a need to play such cards causes even more problems for them fundamentally, which then demands them to be designed to accomplish insane feats, not even just because of power creep, but because of pure necessity to meet the game's philosophy. Kaijus are at least a more healthy and balanced type of board breaker for the game, since they tribute one monster, and you can only have one on either side of the field. Of course, since they aren't engine, relying on them resolving this issue invalidates the game's depth. The problem is in the fact they need to exist, with so many cards that can only be addressed by them. Fortunately for Kaijus, their design doesn't break the game on a wider scale when they aren't addressing those specific issues. Considering Sphere Mode and Lava Golem tribute more cards off, and are too niche and designed to see consistent play, they are genuinely healthy cards, and it's concerning that Konami has yet to find more healthy design solutions like them, deciding that printing cards like Sangen Summoning is the only solution for going second. Going second sucks, so Konami's solution, instead of working down the power level of what you can do going first, and establishing better infrastructure around going second cards, the solution is always nuclear. Tenpai's field spell just invalidates interactions so the battle phase can actually happen. And Transcendent Dragon makes sure they can't even do anything in battle either. It leads to non-games that are frustrating in the very same way, just on the opposite turn. Despite Tenpai not being seen as a de facto best deck, no one liked its associated gameplay loop, and as it grew more prominent, that didn't change. There is no real appeal to these types of decks, because their philosophy is built on the basis you'll always go second, which you won't by the very nature of the game. Going second decks on a fundamental level suck, because they're designed to go second. Regardless of the disparity between first and second, decks designed to only work under specific conditions are just bad in premise. Decks shouldn't be designed to go first or second, they should be designed to work. Like I said with Pendulum and Trap archetypes, these are fundamentally going first decks, and if they don't go first, they have an uphill battle that standard decks don't. What's the point of playing these decks if they lose to pure chance, divorced from any actual gameplay? Why bother when you can just play a better deck that doesn't rely on the coin flip? We have a going first deck like Gimmick Puppet, an actual FTK, where they chose to apply the same philosophy behind Tenpai, having a field spell that invalidates player interaction to ensure you always execute the game-winning combo without fail. Gimmick Puppet is so frustrating as an FTK because it invalidates hand traps entirely, and since the game is dependent on them balancing the environment, a deck that literally FTKs and invalidates the game's own philosophical balancing just highlights how utterly pointless it is. Konami decided to print the Charmies as a means of balancing out going second. The delusional excuse that people gave for Mach C as a positive was that it fixes going second. It doesn't, because the person going first can also use it, after already exemplifying every other issue with game balance, only serving to further magnify every single issue with the game. So they printed the Charmies that functionally do the same thing, but are only really usable going second. The problem is, everything I said about Mach C being bad philosophically still applies to them. You're relying on drawing a specific card to fix the game's balance. You're hoping it hoses your opponent out of playing the game entirely. The only difference is now you're hoping you never draw it going first. Design that loads your hand with cards just changes the balance of the game entirely. Despite printing a shuffling clause, I've never seen it resolve once, let alone matter. Oh, but don't worry, you're gonna need those draws because of another wretched design philosophy. Hand ripping. It's a design principle that's becoming far too common of an occurrence, creating even more issues going second. This design snuck into Mermail, and it keeps sneaking its way into more and more decks. While these may be older cards simply reaching a boiling point, they don't seem to be a dying breed. Some are banned, and many are not. Worst of all, more cards like them are still being printed. K9 is a newer archetype that I'd actually consider pretty well designed and balanced, but for some reason, someone at Konami refuses to design cards that are healthy for the game's environment, and insists that toxic effects like these have to be a common occurrence. Not only printing it on Werewolf, but also leaving this abomination around when it's being used in the same deck. This design doesn't have to exist. K9 is already competent. Toxicity doesn't equal good. Stun is proof of that. All these serve to do is make going second even more frustrating. When you need every resource you can muster to contest the boards of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, actively designing cards to lessen those resources is fundamentally bad for the game. I genuinely wouldn't put it past Konami if this is why the Charmies exist, because while they are also designed to only really be used going second, they give you more resources to contest and potentially break a board. But this just tells me Konami thinks hand-ripping is fine, because surely you'll just open a Charmy and draw enough cards that it won't matter. It is once again designing balance around a hypothetical scenario and not the actual game itself. So the real question after reflecting on all these issues is, how do we build a better foundation for the game's overall health? What do we supplant these harmful philosophies with to truly improve the game's quality? It does feel as though Konami have made a genuine effort to dial things back a bit, though I'm not sure if it was intended at this point. The Mole Charmies are clearly fractional powers of Mach C. Granted, the OCG still has Mach C legal, but with them and the new Dominus traps, it seems as though Konami's trying to distill the potency of the game's current hand traps into something more balanced, potentially intending to fade the older ones out of the game once all the replacements are in place, with Fualos being the true replacement for Mach C, since summoning from the decks is common to the point of being unavoidable. The only difference is that there are fewer draws involved. The Shuffle Clause attempts to address the issue with Mach C drawing a million cards. This neglects the fact you can spend cards from your hand, namely hand traps, the thing that's already a concern with Mach C, leaving there to be no repercussions most of the time anyways. Distilling Mach C still doesn't address the core issue behind it, considering what Mach C intends to do is toxic regardless of how it's diluted. Drawing a ton of cards because your opponent plays the game doesn't actually address the game's balance meaningfully, because it's entirely dependent on uncontrollable random factors. It just needs to die off, period. Meows is a card that is awful since most decks don't summon from Banished and Grave excessively, but against decks that do, it's just an auto-win card. Making them specific only sets them up as niche auto-wins, punishing specific archetypes for existing. Peruli exists because someone at Konami was furious that they couldn't auto-win against Flu with Mach C. These cards don't seek to actually balance the game. They just want to balance Mach C, requiring you to play different versions of it in the side to auto-win against the strategies they oppress. The reality is, you can't balance Mach C, because it was never designed with genuine balance in mind. Why have I talked about Mach C so much when it's banned in the TCG? Because the assholes designing this game are making cards with the idea that it is legal. With them designing the Charmies, it's apparent the message isn't clear enough. This design is fundamentally unhealthy. From the OCG and Master Duel, it's very clear that Mach C doesn't even do its job. The Charmies don't make it any healthier, it just makes it conditionally obnoxious. Off script, I recall from the most recent YCS, Fualos was dropped, and the crowd cheered, and it was responded to with an Ash Blossom, which caused the crowd to roar even louder. The minigame hasn't gone away, it's only changed in name. Erase this thing for good, and design will be forced to improve on a broader scale. If Konami wants decks to special summon less, well, I have good news about who's responsible for printing the cards. Whoever made the Dominus cards require you not use 3 attributes, then proceeded to make them all unusable in Vanquish Soul, I will be seeing you in hell. Just like with the Charmies, I feel these also fall flat in their execution. They're just less egregious since there are deck building and gameplay ramifications in using them. You can get away using them in a deck with the attributes they cut off, either by not using them as a hand trap, or just shaping play around losing said cards from the game. Purge is the most steep ask of the two. Cutting off Fire means losing out on Ash, though you can spend an Ash beforehand, and of course, losing out on Darks means losing out on the most powerful attribute in the game. They introduce an element of risk and reward in deck building around the attribute limitations. Realistically, you can only play them effectively in a deck that doesn't use the attributes that they nullify. This gives an opportunity for underdog archetypes to gain access to powerful staples. Staples that are exclusive enough that it actually helps them close the gap in power level. However, they can just print a broken archetype that can use these cards, like how they did with Malice. What a coincidence, this busted archetype can also freely use the most busted Dominus card. This ultimately creates the same issue that Nibiru does, but in reverse, where a deck that can't play the card is arbitrarily worse off. A deck's ability to play the card also means, to truly balance said deck, they have to balance it around the fact that they can play these cards. The reality still is, those underdog archetypes that want these should be boosted directly, because a generic boost is still generic. While the Charmies and Max C should just be cut losses, I think the Dominus cards just need further design evaluation. Hand traps that are actual traps and gain benefits if used normally are a great design principle. Imperm already pioneered that. Having the benefit being that their harsh locks don't apply is great. It's much closer to being a genuine balance for powerful generic card design, since they pose risk-reward elements while also serving as a challenge for deck building, as well as encouraging consideration for lines around using the card in scenarios where you do play the attributes that they limit. Spiral feels like the perfect iteration of the design. It cuts off light and darks, the two most common attributes, immediately affording all of the lesser powered attributes a strong staple, and unlike Purge and Impulse, Spiral's a healthy form of interruption, being a bounce of a monster rather than a negate. This type of design interaction needs to be more common in the game, unlike Floodgates. If Konami wants Floodgates to exist, they have to reflect on the modern game's design. A modern take off the top of my head would be something similar to Nibiru, but instead of wiping a board after 5 summons, it shuts off all monsters summoned afterwards, making it so their existing board has to do something while leaving room for their plays to still do something. Focusing more on genuinely reining in the power in the game rather than erasing it on the spot completely, capping the power level instead of draining it entirely. But I also don't have to come up with an example for what a balanced Floodgate would look like, because Konami already made one. M-Pen is a card that actually applies nuance behind its design. It is skill drain, but only for special summon monsters in attack position. There's no need to draw an out to it, because it just forces the opponent to play differently in order to play around it. Most Floodgates don't offer that ability in the slightest. An easy example is with There Can Be Only One. The way to play around it is just manifesting a monster with a different type. Sure would be a shame if a lot of archetypes were only one typing. Their design just invalidates archetypes that can't conform to their imposed rules. They only seek to invalidate diverse design behind archetypes. They don't attempt to dynamically engage with them, which is what ends up leading to so many non-games. M-Pen, on the other hand, is designed with specific wording so that it also doesn't hinder the normal summon, which is often the most crucial summon for decks, giving the opponent the ability to do everything they need to, but simply forcing them to special summon in defense to resolve their effects. M-Pen doesn't suddenly place pressure on the opponent to have a card that can answer and out it, but rather your opponent now has to approach the game differently and make concessions about how they play to progress their game plan. The need to summon in defense actively prolongs the game by potentially preventing the opponent from OTKing, which is much healthier than attempting to end the game on the spot entirely. The problem is, this is one of the only Floodgates with nuanced design, and it's in a deck that's capable of playing multiple Floodgates with zero nuanced design. Of course, this design isn't entirely sound for universal balance. There's always the reality that a Floodgate is going to invalidate some strategy in the game. After all, M-Pen does invalidate link strategies, since they can't be summoned in defense. That's why I don't think they're worth pursuing as a universal way of balancing the game in the first place. I can understand why Konami might think it a necessity, but if they're working under that idea, they're not working very hard on it, and that's the biggest issue with their continued existence in the game. Auto-win Floodgates turn side decking, a crucial part of the competitive game, into a joke, where you're loading your side deck with cards that win matches for free. This fact alone should make it apparent just how awful these cards are for the game's health. But for some reason, Konami loves to just bury their head in the sand. They can't keep doing this. If they're meant to sell decks, it's not working. I mentioned Malice and its ties to Shifter earlier, but it's a deck that, despite its strength, has seen upset after upset, due to the side deck being the killer for the deck's success. While I wouldn't say I want Malice to be a decorated YCS veteran, this toxic design doesn't even work to support the very things they're intending to prop up with it. The idea that Konami can't ban every Floodgate at once is just plain stupid. It's unproductive and adds nothing. It's a refusal to address the issue and a meaningless resignation. It also doesn't hold up because they made Genesis, where they functionally already did just that. Of course, there are some outliers, which tells me someone has a preference for war criminals. But there's also the instances of Master Duel's event ban list that make it clear Konami are fully aware how detrimental these cards are to gameplay. It's just a means of committing to it once and for all. On the matter of combo, the biggest first step is to take a step away from one-card combos, especially when using them to fix older cards. Design more support that gets genuine use out of the older cards. That way you see them being useful more often than not intending to make them as just garnets, but turning them into a genuine asset, making their usefulness dynamic and non-linear. The load-bearing design of one-card combos actively makes decks worse, because all it translates to is a self-destruct button anytime you can't resolve the combo. Since your deck's functionality can be boiled down to a singular card, it becomes far easier to shut it off entirely. Konami has to actually put a limit on how many effects are crammed into a single card, because they're treating every card like they have the text real estate of pendulums. Simplicity is king. Have an effect on field, and an effect in hand, or grave, or some other variation. Springin's Tri-Brigade kit is perhaps one of the best cards ever printed, not by means of raw power, but by achieving so much with so little. It's a card tasked with supporting 2 different archetypes, 3 technically if you count Albaz, which is more of a series of cards, and yet it manages to do so perfectly without any bloat. She's a free extender if you're playing either of the archetypes in her name, and she gets you another body in play once she's been used in a way that both the archetypes intend to. The only part that could be considered bloat is listing the 3 archetypes. But thank God that anytime a card lists things, they actually format the card text to be digestible. She's a card with 2 strong, simple, and concise effects. This should be standard design. It makes cards far more digestible and far healthier overall. Design should emphasize more cards pulling their weight, instead of having a single card carry the whole archetype. Pacing out effects between more cards is much better. Other than the card text itself, combo as a playstyle needs to evaluate the meaning of pace and power. In terms of modern combo decks, Yumi formats combo into something far more palatable, but ends up still being absurd, especially with Mitsurugi lumped in. Yumi actually puts value behind their monsters as materials, having effects you can use if summoned in general, or a separate bonus effect if they're summoned by a synchro, with their synchros having overall solid effects as both interruption and play enablers, with their playstyle around the Link one allowing you to synchro on your opponent's turn. While their interactions are far more engaging gameplay-wise, the sheer amount of them creates an entirely different problem. There's so much they can do that it feels like you're just going to lose unless you stop them from spinning their wheels in the first place. While Yumi has much healthier design elements, Combo's balance is still aching without better limitations. Certainly doesn't help that this wretch is still legal. I feel Killer Tune is a more balanced iteration of Yumi's design. The official translation just came out. I'm just gonna call them Wicked Tune from here on out. But they've still felt the need to include undesirable design in their cards, having extra deck rips present. These 2 archetypes do highlight the fact that there's another way to design combo decks, a way that's much healthier on a fundamental level. Designing combo decks that aren't meant to do everything within the first turn. Design principles like Flu, Goaty, and Centurion should be prevalent in the game. I'm going to hit you with a grand revelation, since the player base seems to need to hear this. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a 2-player game. 2 people are supposed to be actively participating in the game at all times. I remember Farfa at one point talking about how modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels as though it's a 30-minute unskippable cutscene that you just have to sit through, or you just don't like modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This is Stockholm Syndrome, not an actual assessment of what plagues modern Yu-Gi-Oh!'s design. The cutscene analogy doesn't work technically, because in any 2-player game where there's a cutscene, both players are sat with a thumb up their ass. If one player is experiencing gameplay while the other is sat in a cutscene, something's wrong with the game. The cutscene analogy on a figurative level does sniff out the other misconceptions with modern design philosophy though. Hand traps are your QTE inputs for these cutscenes, giving you the illusion of interaction. But unlike QTEs, you can just never get the prompt to begin with, or they can just end up being ultimately pointless. Add to the fact your opponent can also hit you with a QTE during their unskippable cutscene. So how do you get around this issue of drawing hand traps or you don't get to interact going second? The solution is actually simple. simple: designing archetypes to play more on your opponent's turn. Decks that play on your opponent's turn still embody modern Yu-Gi-Oh's design and actually adapt it in a healthy way. By having you pass turn over to your opponent now has agency in the game. They can interact with you without needing to draw specific hand traps in order to do so, and you can still build a board in the process. Your opponent has to, in real time, figure out your plan and adequate choke points as it's playing out. You are engaged in a scenario where adaptive decision making is at the forefront. Centurion's native design has you making a single synchro monster, so you can then set up the ability to do it again on your opponent's turn. Goaty follows a similar principle, having you synchro once to then establish synchros as a means of interruption during your opponent's turn, giving these decks a genuine reasonable way to play under Nibiru, which then highlights Nibiru actually punishing overcommitting, like it's supposed to. This is in stark contrast to the years of synchro slop design, wherein Konami refused to acknowledge the gameplay ramifications of performing a million synchros a turn. These two take a far more streamlined and healthy approach to synchros, something that's necessary since the reputation of synchros has actively been damaged by the other approach to synchro design. While Yummy and Wicked Tune may be a mixed bag in execution, it isn't because of this philosophy, but the other principles I've outlined as a problem. It's baffling to me to see people genuinely say, "I hate Centurion for playing on my turn," for them to then in the same statement say, "The deck sucks because it allowed me the opportunity to interact," which then led to me winning. My brother in Christ, you hate this game. You are complaining about a 2-player game being a 2-player game, and then saying the deck is bad because it let you play the game. The only world where you get frustrated by this type of design is when decks bloat their plays through both turns, and most of these decks tend to make their turn shorter. There's actual game balance at play in this type of design. This achieves the modern ideal for what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is at its core, being able to combo off while still having both players actively engaged in the game. The problem isn't speed, it's pacing. Not only does pacing a deck's combo out between both turns give your opponent agency, it prevents turns from being bloated in length, improving the game's overall flow. The biggest issue with the game is that it's been designed like it's a single-player game, structuring most archetypes to function like an entirely different game in a bubble, with the only way to win against said decks effectively being to pop that bubble before it gets anywhere, refusing to acknowledge how design needs to adapt to a modern context to actually reflect it being a 2-player game. Archetypes that space out their plan between turns aren't the only way to adapt to that fact. Of course, not every single deck can be designed in one set way, otherwise gameplay variety dies. The other path for card design to follow is expanding even further on turn 0 cards. Tyr had the right idea in one way. Havness was a card that allowed you to play on your opponent's turn. It didn't matter if you were going second or not. It wasn't a ubiquitous hand trap meant to curb the game's power imbalance. It was a way to actually enable Tearlament's own strategy, allowing you to interact with your opponent at all times regardless of who won the die roll. The entire point behind a 2-player game, preventing games from being one-sided slogs, which is part of the reason people like Tyr formats so much. Havness established an ideal future design philosophy for the game on a broader scale, designing archetypal monsters that provide the level of interaction hand traps afford, but actually allow a way to play the game as opposed to attempting to turn it off. Not long after, Labyrinth would release with their furniture monsters following suit. These productive archetypal hand traps, dubbed Turn 0 cards, enable you to play the game sooner rather than later. The problem with generic hand traps is their very philosophy. Their design is entirely based on reductive interactions. It sets your opponent back, but it also sets you back if the card in question doesn't strangle the life out of your opponent. It creates a lose-lose scenario where it has to be extremely potent at stopping your opponent, otherwise you're going -1 for no genuine benefit. These turn 0 cards actually provide productive interactions. Instead of praying you can prevent your opponent from building an unbreakable board, you actually get to start your own game plan. You have agency in how the game plays out, leading to you playing your own deck and using its interactions to actually compete against one another, regardless of who went first. This makes the die roll far less likely to determine the result of the match, which is one of the biggest issues with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Justice Hunters is a set that debuted more cards that embody this principle. Draco Tail Phimena just lets you generically fuse turn 0, and while the fusion is generic, the design clearly best works with its own lineup of fusions. K9 Izuna lets you Xyz summon in conjunction with Lupus. On top of that, K9 actually functions in a way to punish hand traps, without casting your opponent into the sun for doing so, all while actually building up their own game plan in the process. It's a much needed change of pace for card design. If only Konami didn't feel the need to print hand ripping on these cards. The most frustrating part of their design is the hand ripping. Between Werewolf and Masquerade, this archetype that's already extremely strong is capable of ripping multiple cards. This design needlessly makes games more frustrating. Mermail does it. Ouroboros, perhaps the most fitting card to mention in this video, also did this. The latest X-Saber support intends to enable the original Gothams, who has a hand ripping effect. Hecka Hands does it. Elven Notes does it. It has to stop. With the sheer amount of them releasing, I am genuinely concerned Konami is stupid enough to believe hand-ripping balances Mach C in the Charmies. If hand-ripping is common enough, surely you'll just offset it with a million draws. At best, this is another foolish Ouroboros approach. At worst, this is just bad game design on a fundamental level. This type of design needs to stop in its tracks, regardless of whatever excuse Konami thinks justifies it. You don't have to print more cards like these, since the existing ones have and will continue to bring out this issue. It's not something you need to keep adding into the game, because it only takes away from the game. The same goes for extra deck ripping. They decided to implement extra deck ripping in Wicked Tune, on the turn 0 card no less. Genuinely 1 step forward and 2 steps back, encapsulated in a single card. Removing cards before they can make an impact on gameplay is poor game design, period. Kashtira already highlighted how bad this was with Diablosis and Unicorn. Was the takeaway that it's fine if it's random? These aren't design elements that contribute to a healthy gameplay environment. They only provide a frustrating and unfair power to decks, creating non-games in a different way. The game doesn't have to find more ways to create non-games. It has to find more ways to create games. While Lab came much earlier than the Justice Hunters archetypes, it further iterated on the design behind Turn 0, containing multiple different cards that play Turn 0 via the furniture. Since they only really benefit Lab, you aren't playing them in every deck. And unlike Havnis, Phimena, or Izuna, there's a higher number of them in archetype, so you're much more likely to open at least one of them most games while playing the deck, leading to the ability to play on an opponent's turn 1 consistently, which is a massive boon to trap decks. But this brings us to the only issue with these cards being a positive. They do carry the same issue that hand traps do, and the fact that you have to draw them, but these are far healthier in design principle. As long as we keep a handle on how generically these cards can be used, this should be present in the future of archetypal design. The only conflict of interest is that Konami's already made the Charmies, under the impression they actually do something positive for the game, which actively makes this design philosophy into a liability. Because drawing more cards in a game where turn 0 cards are common ensures the game becomes unbalanced in a different way. You can't fix balance with quantity when you already have a quality control issue on a broad scale. The balance is in making your cards hold more value the way that turn 0 cards do, actually giving the game a way to consistently achieve healthier gameplay on a regular basis. Mach C's ilk and general hand traps will never accomplish this because they only seek to reduce games to nothing. I see people saying the Charmies are good because of their relation to turn 0 cards, since you can play around them by passing and using them on your opponent's turn instead. But that's the neat thing about design. The Charmies don't have to exist in order for Konami to just design cards to function like that in the first place. It's just a matter of actually making design healthy for the game in general. There's also the fact that this argument folds in on itself because playing around them requires turn 0 cards, which is already an issue people have. The real concern to have with turn 0 cards is that every archetype retroactively needs one now. And when you consider the fact Konami couldn't be bothered to do that with Lynx, when decks literally needed them in order to function, it's not likely they'd do so. So Konami needs to appropriately adjust design on a broader scale to match this direction. Another concern to address is actually banning cards that are abused constantly. This directly relates to the issue of floodgates, but this is about taking action against non-game design as a whole. While Lab is capable of unsavory things, that's entirely due to the fact that there are just auto-win trap cards that shouldn't be legal to begin with, not the intrinsic design of Lab. These cards are never resolving in a game that could be considered healthy. It doesn't matter if it's in Lab or not. The consistency to do so isn't the problem. The fact you can do it in the first place is. These decks are what I'd consider well thought out and healthy design premises for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The issue is, there are simply still elements overlooked in design, deliberately or not, like D-Barrier or every virus card just proving, hey, maybe these cards should never be good, as they'll only ever contribute to non-games when they're played. You'd think that Labyrinth would have highlighted that fact, but no, it was the deck itself, not the cards that people were complaining about ruining games. Tier was so comically busted while milling both players, it forced you to play a graveyard strategy, and since it was also the best deck, a Tier 0 format was inevitable. They banned the Ishizu millers, and this issue went away. Although it really went away because they also chose to gut the entire archetype itself in the same breath. Centurion's ability to consistently synchro on the opponent's turn finally forced Konami to ban Calamity, a card that was already a nuisance to gameplay anytime it was summoned. Flu's ability to search a Wing Beast forced Konami to ban the Wind Barrier statue. Once again, a card that already caused problems, but only got addressed when Konami could no longer ignore it. Object permanence isn't Konami's strong suit, but considering they just hit more of them, I'm sure we'll get to the rest eventually. I want people to realize and understand the fundamentals aren't the problem with these archetypes. It's the practice and willful negligence Konami employs to push them over the edge. It's important now more than ever to make sure that we stop letting this type of design shape the game, because all it does is make the game look abysmal. Paradise Smasher was banned, and this is obviously good, but Konami has shown a willingness to bring back these toxic cards later. They brought back Apotos, a card that facilitates the same unhealthy gameplay, but because a tiered strategy wasn't capable of using it anymore, it was fine to come back. Wouldn't you know it, a tiered strategy is able to use it again, and it's suddenly a problem again. Who could have foreseen that? It's like if I'd put a gun to your head and said, don't worry, it's not loaded, as I stare you in the eyes, loading bullets into the magazine. Now that Protoss is banned again, I'm forced to ask, are they dumb enough to unban it again? It leads me to believe they'll just free Paradise Smasher when there's no longer a tiered strategy that can utilize it. This approach to the legality of these cards is outright moronic. They don't simply stop being a problem once you see them less, they're a problem no matter when you see them, because their intrinsic design is a problem. You're supposed to oversee the entire game's health, not overlook it. Archetypes like Flu don't have to go, Shifter and Featherstorm do, because they invalidate gameplay nuance, and they very well will continue to do so in the future, regardless if it's in Flu or a wholly new archetype, just as Shifter has proven time and time again, with Malice and many more decks. The ban list is meant to balance the game, not just rotate out cards that aren't selling anymore. Here's a tip for you, free of charge, Konami. If you want product to sell, actually make the product good. No one wants to buy product, period, because you've made it overpriced garbage. Using ban lists to force people to buy them doesn't work when no one's even buying the old product in the first place. At least make it appear like the ban list does its intended job. So many decks are pushed by leaving around problematic cards, and all they serve to accomplish is hampering the enjoyability of the game with these decks. No one is going to remember an archetype fondly if the majority of its gameplay identity involved non-game scenarios. No one's going to want legacy support because you've created nothing but a legacy of contempt for them. That's of course assuming they ever make legacy support, since these non-game cards are typically kept around to support these archetypes that can use them. If you want people to enjoy archetypes that can abuse these cards, make support for those archetypes. The only legitimate reason they don't is because some archetypes are done, but they can print generic cards that are clearly meant to work with them. Buio and Luce are clearly Burning Abyss cards without actually being them. It's far more enjoyable to see this type of support, not only because it actually aims to help the deck itself, but because it can be used in other archetypes as well, without them being highly abusable cards. It forces design to be more interesting and defined. It all depends on their quality and balance, emphasizing gameplay identity as its strong suit, which is the biggest selling point of archetypal design. Snake Eyes has elements of design that I actually appreciate. Design elements that very obviously didn't have proper restraint or goals in mind. Ash, Poplar, Flamberge, and Oak are immense card value. Card value that insulates you from board breaking. It's phenomenal how fast you can just go from being Raigeki'd to like a +4. It's satisfying in that regard of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But of course, this was all easily exploitable with the cavalcade of generic negates being easy to barf out with them, while still having heaps of advantage and interaction in reserve. There's also the Pendulum Hate Crime printed on Flamberge, but that's a different matter. I couldn't tell you that I look forward to or even want legacy support for Snake Eyes because of their legacy, but their poor reputation is mostly to do with the unhealthy cards Konami willfully left in the game's ecosystem to push them. This isn't exclusive to Snake Eyes, this applies to multiple decks in the game. There are a lot of archetypes people genuinely don't want to see again because they're associated with frustrating cards. The TCG has dealt with such cards, but it's evident that this is only one step forward, as Konami continually takes 2 steps back. Problematic card design still remains rampant. The only difference is, it's not tied to an archetype that's dominating the metagame for over a year, showing they only take action if they're forced to. To me, Goblin Bikers are a much more well-designed version of Snake Eyes. With how many bodies you can just summon together and build up advantage with, it gives that same kick. Clatter Sploder summoning on your opponent's turn, reviving Merciless or Gone Wild to then summon out another Goblin. But of course, they weren't completely absurd in design, so they didn't end up performing on a level equal to Snake Eyes. Goblin Bikers are an archetype designed without any locks, but they aren't broken as a result, because their intrinsic design actively encourages you to play them as an Xyz deck, with the flexibility to use them to do more. There are so many games I play with Goblin where I feel I can actually play through intense boards, without needing some absurd blowouts to do so. It actually feels like I, as a player, had to think out my use of resources to break the board and mount my own offense. The only real problem is that they're dependent on an Xyz being on field to accomplish that consistently, which isn't very easy to maintain going second. The archetype's so well designed that if it just had a little more innate extension, it'd be a wonderful deck to play on any occasion. In contrast, Snake Eyes doesn't really have this going for it. Despite being a deck of almost exclusively level 1s, there was no rank 1 facet to their design. They have a card that's a literal free body so long as you control a fire, and there was zero incentive to play it. Why bother to play this idiot if there's no rank 1 to make it a crucial extender? And despite the deck's ability to swarm the board with multiple free bodies and insane revival with Flamberge and Oak, they had no links in archetype. So the archetype really had little gameplay direction other than to channel its insane resources into the most powerful generic cards. This gave the deck freedom, but at the expense of a genuine playstyle. It's, as I said earlier, the illusion of open-endedness. True open-endedness is found in options and versatility, not desperation. That fact isn't present in their design, and it always should have been. Snake Eyes' main gimmick was around placing monsters into the back row and summoning them out with Flamberge and Temple, but this wasn't channeled into a unique playstyle, since all it would amount to is Link climbing with IP, to then recycle her to make another Link during your opponent's turn, usually Apo. Putting her in the back row to summon her didn't provide any unique style to the deck. It was just functionally reborning a monster. Their ability to put the opponent's monsters in the back row was also contentious, since clogging a spell and trap zone is obnoxious removal. It's not exactly easy to remove them in most decks, genuinely staining your board, so most decks lose both the card put there and the zone they're put in for the rest of the game. This is especially a problem when 2 of those zones are required to be free for an entire mechanic to function, making it so putting a card in any of those zones immediately ends the game. It took until Doom Dragon to really play off their back row placement design, having you build up multiple to summon it out, but it certainly didn't help both it and Vengeance Dragon further using it on your opponent. I mean, realistically, the solution is as simple as telling Konami to stop screwing over Pendulum, but that's like telling Konami to stop breathing at this point, and their brains are clearly already starved for oxygen. Pendulum should just be able to remove cards from those zones by placing scales, having the relation between the pen zone and spell trap zone beneath it work like field spells do in the field zone, sending any card in the spell trap zone to the grave in order to use the pendulum zone. You make a fix like that, and this element of Snake Eyes design becomes far less problematic for the game's ecosystem. Locks are typically just a sign of uninspired balancing, something that will seemingly arbitrarily be applied to some archetypes over others. Instead of attempting to address how the design could be abused, it just avoids it entirely, and as a result, cuts off potential for actual engaging synergies. It takes away freedom for the sake of convenience. Locks don't have to be a universal balancer for card design. The best form of locking is cards that are designed like clear checkpoints rather than full-on locks. Locking you while a specific card is on field, assessing the fact that the card leads to abuse generically, but it's a measure to prevent just that, while also not making the archetype xenophobic. There's subtle design that demands you play the archetype itself for it to go anywhere. Notably, an issue with links is that you can always access them, and they have a tendency to snowball gameplay quality down the drain. If you design a powerful combo piece that locks you into the archetype while it's on field, it presents a challenge, not a restriction. So long as you don't also give them a free link one, you're forced to use it for what the archetype wants, but it doesn't come at the detriment of deck building expression. It just makes it more rewarding. Valmonica is the best example of a way to balance without locks. Despite having link ones that can be made with any monster, you can't just do that in any deck. Their design requires you to get counters to summon them, something you won't be doing unless you're playing the deck in full, meaning you are playing Valmonica, but doing so doesn't come at the expense of freedom in deck building. Their generic nature serves the archetype rather than the archetype serving a generic use. Elven Notes is an archetype that encapsulates the type of design balance I'm talking about, yet it also employs unhealthy design in the process despite it. The archetype has this unique dynamic around the central monster zone, focusing on moving in and out of the center for their effects, and modulating levels for synchro summoning. It's a unique playstyle, but then they feel the need to make it pay off into a floodgate. Their boss is functionally a D barrier and a mass negate. Add this to the fact they have a hand rip, and you have an extremely frustrating gameplay experience. Because designing meaningful and unique gameplay interactions pertaining to playstyle is too hard, evidently. Just make toxic effects a process of jumping through hoops. That justifies them because they're tedious to use. It doesn't. It's just lazy and boring design. There's a little nuance to the design in that the Synchro's effect apply to cards on resolution of effect, with the negate only being on Synchro Summon. But the very philosophy behind its power is once again attempting to invalidate gameplay, rather than genuinely engage with it. Dragunity's latest support is also guilty of this. While its design is reliant on utilizing the archetype's actual playstyle around equips, it's in service of negates and floodgates. They're uninspired pieces of anti-interaction. Arceus can be passed off since it at least takes the more nuanced approach to negation, only hitting cards that are face-up on field. Their new link, however, is just phoned in entirely. A negate, floodgate, and a way to cheat out their synchros. Importantly, Arceus or Aridbar, which are both negates. It just does everything in a lazy and unengaging way. And wouldn't you know it, they printed the second coming of Hulk to make it an even more annoying card. I don't want to go on a tangent about this card. All I have to say about it is, if your problem with this card's existence is that it goes into George, I think you might have a problem with George. Decks don't deserve an auto-win payoff for being weak. This is just a resignation telling me you don't actually care about utilizing their unique design to any genuine effect. They deserve actual respect, using their unique playstyle to maneuver the current meta landscape, doing so in a way that no other deck can, not being handed an auto-win as a participation trophy. They're win conditions in the most shallow sense. It isn't designing them to win so much as it's designing them to kill the opponent, only attempting to drain the life from your opponent's deck and win by default. Every deck in the game is innately meant to have a win condition. If the win condition is your opponent doesn't play the game, even Viacroid can do that if your opponent has a stroke. There's no unique design attached to the archetype where you feel you've distinctly won with that archetype. All that tells you you won with them are the names printed on the cards, not the effects. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't a name game. When it comes to well-balanced design structure, there really isn't a better example than Vanquish Soul. It's the best designed deck in the context of a game's modern landscape. The way the deck is designed, you're deliberately holding cards in hand for your effects. This gives you a reason to not spam the field recklessly, as it functionally turns your monsters into vanillas, creating a natural balance to prevent you from barfing out too many monsters, while not doing so as an active detriment to the deck on a fundamental level. The fact the archetype is reliant on monster reveals also means that spells and traps aren't ideal to run if they can't also generate attributes to enable the deck's playstyle. If they don't really help the deck to push their game plan, the inclusion of staple spells and traps is a bit iffy, with cards that need to discard, like Super Poly, being an even steeper cost in the context of Vanquish Soul. It creates a risk versus reward dynamic in deck building with spells and traps, demanding you assess just how important these cards are to run, and what cards can better serve the archetype's playstyle. Of course, you can also find hand traps with the proper attributes to fill in the interactive niches of spell traps. With the more niche hand traps having a place as useful reveals, you can also side deck, and generally good cards being perfect for the main deck, with the Bystials being a strong consideration since Magnamut replaces an attribute, either by grabbing another Bystial or by grabbing Caesar, because Caesar is a dragon. This relation to hand traps isn't to make the deck out as being super powerful for it though. Their effects revealing for cost gives your opponent info, making it so your opponent can play around that knowledge. Vanquish Soul loses out on many other powerful hand traps that don't provide an attribute, at least not unless you're willing to risk playing cards that can catastrophically brick you. Vanquish Soul encourages you to leverage your cards at their most opportune time, either in finding an opening to go all in for a lethal push that could leave you vulnerable, or biding your time until you can actually make a push with their effects still live, potentially holding hand traps for the sake of retaining reveal effects, searching out attributes you need for reveals over names you want for their power, knowing the perfect time to use the tag out names, either offensively to push or defensively to potentially dodge an effect, quite literally knowing when to hold and when to fold your opponent. Their column-based effects put an emphasis on placement from both you and your opponent. The column-based design also prevents a restrictive interaction with their tagging out. Since they no longer inhabit a column, they don't affect the opponent's card in the column that they were in, creating a dynamic behind tagging them out to potentially dodge an effect in response to their own, forfeiting the destruction for the sake of retaining them for later. Most of the Vanquish Soul monsters are so independently good, you don't want to sack them off for generic cards. Like Goblin Bikers, the intrinsic design encourages you to play them one way, but it doesn't force you to. You're still granted versatility. It's just a matter of knowing when to tap into it, knowing your limits and how to surpass them. It makes the deck extremely fun to play since variation depends on the game itself. Vanquish Soul's design encourages thought-out resource management with a strong emphasis on adaptive and predictive decision-making, not dissimilar to the skills present in actual fighting games. Add to that, the fact all of its monsters have different effects attached to different reveal costs, giving them dynamic and diverse ways to play out a game. It's genuine open-ended design. It's my favorite archetype in the game for that reason. And somehow, people got mad that I deconstructed how Konami flubbed this perfect structure on its release. And now that the deck is actually competent at achieving its gameplay goals, people hate it. Because meta bad. Since Konami doesn't care about genuine healthy design, they hit the archetype itself and one of the cards that contributed to non-games against it. And what do you know, the game's health suddenly tanked. Oops. Requiring an emergency update list not long after. Choosing to hit the cards that contributed to games, and not all of the cards that actively contributed to non-games, was certainly a well-thought-out decision. This has happened in past formats, it's happened again, and it will continue to happen in the future if Konami doesn't finally acknowledge the game's overall health. The emergency list only hit cards that were an immediate problem, with the egregious omission being the choice to leave the other barrier statues legal. Despite admitting that these cards only enable design they don't want present in the game, they will just leave them in so they can become a problem later. There really was no way to foresee this happening. Vanquish Soul realistically only needed the field spell for consistency, since Mad Love wasn't a starter for the deck despite searching a spell trap, but Sue took the deck to even greater heights, giving the deck a true turn 0 card. Sue is an insanely powerful card that allows you to play Vanquish Soul turn 0. It's the Havness effect, but for a deck that wasn't made tier 0. But instead of people taking away how great it is to have this design present for an archetype, it's not fair Vanquish Soul gets a turn 0 card and fucking Dark Scorpion doesn't. So it's gotta go because it's not fair. when the reality is more archetypes should have this in their design, as it's what best works in the modern landscape of the game. Su's design is even more restrictive than Havnis's. While being easier to trigger, the Dust Devil is in the details. Su has to reveal a Vanquish Soul in order to summon herself. This means you have to be playing Vanquish Soul in a sizable package, otherwise she's pretty useless, meaning you're playing Vanquish Soul as a deck. Then, with the intrinsic design behind the reveal effects in the archetype, you need attributes en masse for it to even be reliable. There's no splashing them in water, light, or wind decks, so they're even more limited in their use. It's design built in service to the archetype itself, rather than designed for it to be abused generically. Xiaolong also highlights another element of balance behind the idea of turn 0 cards. Because Su is a turn 0 card, that means Xiaolong becomes a turn 0 card by proxy. This was always true, given Pluton is a turn -1 card. It only became notable when there was suddenly a good means of doing so. This is another facet of turn 0 card design that needs to be built upon, having cards that become turn 0 under certain circumstances. Not only to further help a deck's power, but to also limit how generically they can be used. It helps these decks play the game more often than not, while also serving as a means to curb the generic usage of these cards. The only concern is, once again, the density of these turn 0 cards. K9 is the only archetype in the game that feels like it was specifically designed to work with Vanquish Soul. They're a rank 5 strategy with a turn 0 card that actively makes one for its effect. Both Xiaolong and Su are level 5 turn 0 cards. But most importantly, the K9s are Vanquish Soul attributes. They come together perfectly while being independently powerful archetypes. However, people are cramming K9 in other decks with level 5s, as well as decks that don't even have 5s. Of course, those decks weren't as successful as the Vanquish Soul build, but it's hard to definitively say that's because the synergy between the two is better, or if it's just because they have access to a higher density of turn 0 cards. Because once the Vanquish Soul build got hit, people leaned to the Crystron build, and while they banned a rank 5 Floodgate, they didn't ban another rank 5 Floodgate engine, with Crystron also providing access to a negate, leaving the gameplay to be even less healthy. The deterrent for turn 0 cards becoming an issue is extremely simple. It's the exact same case I've made about many of the other issues. The gameplay identity of these archetypes should be defined enough that playing a pile of them does nothing productive. Havnis was such a specific type of play enabler that it's only realistically good in tier. So designing these cards in such a way that they're only good in archetype keeps them from just winding up as replacements for hand traps, while also encouraging players to hunt down authentic synergies in deck building. Emphasizing genuine synergy over aimless homogeny, it prevents the game from boiling down to just a good stuff pile. Speaking of prevention, negation should not be something extremely easy to access on a generic level, and certainly not in large quantity. Negates are trending away from being omnis that hit any and everything, requiring the negation target to be on field in order to be negated. This is much better because it actually leaves room for counterplay. It has an engaging dynamic to it, since you can effectively dodge the negation by getting the card off the field. It also means effects in the hand and grave still mean something. The issue still is in the quantity and accessibility of these though. Most omni-negates exist just to blanket invalidate any card, and when too many of those cards exist, it just becomes a matter of producing enough cards to invalidate every card that your opponent plays. Negates are preventative cards rather than adaptive, so they should be far less generic regardless, and decks shouldn't be dependent on them to function. People misconstrue this view against generic negates as being against generic bosses entirely, but that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I want generic boss monsters to actually have good design. When I think of generic bosses, I think of cards that serve a niche that helps an archetype because of a synergistic interaction. While DPE was made a generic boss because of Verte being legal, I still enjoyed it being used as a generic boss, because a recursive card that requires you pop a card of your own to pop an opponent's is an actual dynamic piece of interruption. Typically, you'd use it to pop itself, since it could also revive itself and give you a pop again later. But in certain decks, you'd actually want to pop a different card of yours for a benefit. The problem is, DPE isn't truthfully generic, and generic bosses aren't designed in this sort of way. They're designed to be all-purpose blanket solutions rather than pieces of interaction that become far more potent in specific niches, helping select decks in a unique way. Instead, you just fish for negates because Konami hasn't designed certain decks to have a genuinely competent game plan. Very fittingly, the only generic boss monster I can think of that comes close to this criteria is Promethean Princess. She's a generic Link 3 that functions similarly to DPE. She can pop a card you control to pop an opponent's, reviving herself in the process. She also has a separate effect to reborn a fire monster, making it so you can either Link climb or just revive a fire from grave for any other reason. She's generic, but her design around fire monsters and her firelock while she's on field limits how generically she can be used. It prevents her from being abused, but ensures she's a card worth using in more niche settings. The real problem with her is context. She was so clearly designed to push Fire King, a deck that was tiered with the help of Snake Eyes during her release, leading to her becoming an immediate part of the game, which then prompted people to complain about a generic boss monster that was an actual piece of interruption, because it was included in a deck that was also barfing out negates. Now that the deck is no longer relevant and the negates have been reined in, no one cares about her. There doesn't seem to be any urgency to design cards in a similar vein unless it's to push support for an existing dominant strategy. The best we've gotten since is a Baoku, a card most people have already forgotten. More cards with the same philosophy need to be made, and they don't have to be made with the express intent of pushing an already top tier strategy. Because these are the type of cards that should be hanging around from format to format, not the non-game floodgates that Konami continues to leave around. Zarin the Chainbound Dragon is the only really unique take on negation, making it directly revolve around chain links and not just being an automatic answer to any card played by the opponent. It genuinely applies negation in a way that requires thought behind its use. It makes it dynamic to gameplay, providing a way to get around chain blocking and even encouraging players to approach managing their chains more carefully. But while we may be trending towards healthier balance around negation, that doesn't mean we need to mass produce them to replace all of the old ones, because we'll ultimately end up with the same problem, just on a different spectrum. You can design a deck like Sulfa Chord to produce negates in a way they can only really utilize, but the fact of the matter is, you're still underselling the archetype's playstyle mechanically, which is doubly offensive considering it's a pendulum archetype. Electing to only use negates as an endboard shows a serious lack of creativity in design. What about negation is uniquely Sulfa Chord? It's a mechanic that's rife throughout the entire game. I can't see a way where I associate this with its gameplay as a unique style. It's meant to reflect not interrupting a performance, but this is the most shallow way to adapt that into gameplay. The old Sulfa Chord cards represented this with their scale effects. It's just a shame that pendulum summoning without being interrupted doesn't really mean anything when the mechanic's already been gutted anyways. The deck has a clear emphasis on scales, low and high, even and odd, the correlation to their levels and their scales. The archetype can lean into their scales and levels based on evens and odds, providing different play patterns to the deck while you control specific scales. Angelia and Harmonia are the tip of the iceberg for this sort of design. Harmonia letting you control your scales to get out unique effects, and Angelia allowing you to tribute a Sulfa Chord and summon another from deck with a scale differential of 2. But since this sort of design isn't emphasized in their gameplay throughout, there's very little gameplay identity to them. Happiness can grab 2 different scales, which subtly leans into Angelia's effect, allowing you to grab her and another good Sulfa Chord, then tributing that Sulfa to summon out another good one, allowing you to cycle scales to bring out more depth to the music that is your plays. It's just a shame this deck's making music on fucking Dalai Lama. Since there's no genuine design importance to most of their monsters, it falls flat in that regard. These elements of design can be used for far more than just arbitrarily locking a negate behind the archetype. There's more to get people attached to the deck than just it has negates, so you won't get punted into the sun all the time. It just makes it so if they aren't archetypal enough, they can end up as an engine. And making a pendulum engine be negates means we've gotten absolutely nowhere from where we started. Which leads us into talking about engines in general. Fiendsmith is an engine that was shoved in just about every deck for the longest time. Adventure, which came before it, also had a similar stint of splashability, but faded away much quicker. I'd like to see engines of this general power level be made more niche in design. or at the very least, given better design restrictions that require a little more investment to actually use them generically. A good start would be evaluating the ramifications of making them accessible with a link one. As Fiendsmith exists currently, it feels less like a unique engine that helps decks, and more like a fragile crutch if you aren't already a meta-level strategy. Any two monsters can go into the entire engine, and if you draw Engraver or Tract, you get the full engine without needing to commit a normal summon. This made it far too generic, which is a problem when it also generates a mountain of advantage. In contrast, Adventure had a restriction of forfeiting a normal summon effect to use the engine. More of that present on engines and its homogeneity can be reined in and made less problematic. There's also a separate concern behind the very philosophy of engines. Archetypes all have an engine by design. It's how they even function, just like any well-oiled machine. But sometimes archetypes are designed solely as an engine, like Fiendsmith. You can't really play Fiendsmith pure, because it's only two main deck names. And unlike Sky Striker, there isn't really a game plan that leads to a genuine win condition with only the two names in the archetype. There's no gimmick design to the main deck because there's no design in the main deck. The real balance behind engines isn't just how much of it is useful in a generic context. Closed Moon's banning is just a racist ban. There's no mincing words about it. The card was banned for being a generic Link 2 Light Fiend. Even if it was a vanilla, it would be banned. If an engine's health is solely hinged upon the accessibility to it, you've created unstable design. There are loads of archetypes that have engines, but no one's using them as engines, because gameplay context limits how generically applicable they are. If there's no context, there's no limitation. This is a problem not only for the game's health, but the archetypes within it. I enjoy playing with the Fiendsmith cards, but the Fiendsmith game plan is non-existent. There's the theming of equips, but it's so underdeveloped because there are no other names in the main deck, nor spell traps that take that theme in a unique direction. There's no real dynamic use behind equips as a gimmick for the archetype, causing it to not feel like a legitimate gameplay identity or even a win condition. All it amounts to is either a removal tool with Engraver or negation with Desiree. The other fusions don't even have anything to do with equips, and since the archetype is just good at generating free material, this gameplay identity might as well be non-existent. You are forced to play Fiendsmith with something else because you can't even get anywhere with just the cards in the archetype alone. I wish Fiendsmith existed as more than just an engine. As it stands, it is exclusively an engine, and as an engine, it lacks a defining gameplay identity. If you open Engraver or Tract, you just have access to insane resources, all without using your normal summon. This makes it good in just about any deck, and with the ability to weave into it with any two monsters, you have a problem, because hitting it as an engine means hitting the archetype entirely. Something not only due to the archetype being microscopic, but also due to the fact that the engine that makes it run doesn't actually have a unique gameplay identity. There's nothing niche about their application. There's no real synergy behind including them. They're just free, powerful resources. This shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be in a scenario where a card is banned simply for existing to balance out a design issue that could have been avoided entirely by making the engine more than just an engine. This engine issue has become far more prevalent with Mitsurugi. Habakiri, much like Engraver, has an insanely powerful engine effect while not requiring your normal, enabling you to tap into Mitsurugi for very little cost in any deck, making it extremely tantalizing to dump into any other archetype just like Fiendsmith. With time going on, the deck's splash ability has gotten absurd. Even without King of the Feral Imps, it continues to see major play in other archetypes, being used alongside Yummy, which was already an insanely powerful deck. But even then, I don't necessarily want them to have a hard lock. Mitsurugi could have had a lock to only rituals if they're used, but then Mitsurugi would have no extra deck, making the archetype's gameplay far less varied, meaning far less deck building expression. They could have made them Reptile lock, but then they'd be unplayable, because Konami's neglected supporting Reptile for this long, meaning it has better odds with the extra deck lock. These locks then mean Mitsurugi would have no good synergies to play off of the relation between rituals and tributing, which is clearly the archetype's intended design identity, reborning and activating effects when tributed, a far more interesting design element to engage with behind these cards. Realistically, the only design solution is placing locks while they're on field, but there's no point to it because Habakiri is the root of the problem. When you create an issue like this, card design itself should be evaluated because hard locks only mask the real issues you're creating, not actually preventing them. Having more distinct gameplay elements to archetypes makes them less generic, making it so synergies are far more compelling and genuinely push better deck building, and making it so they aren't just free resources. Horus is close to an engine with design restrictions, but its design restrictions are that it's extremely bad. It's an engine that's insanely broken if you draw the singular good card, but god-awful if you don't. I like the discarding facet of their design. It gives them an inherent niche synergy with decks that want their cards engraved, but Imseti and Sark are the only cards that facilitate that, and do something productive for the engine. Every other name is just a brick you have to dump off of Sark. There's also the fact that the engine, when it goes off, is functionally a more broken version of Master Rule 3 Pendulum, requiring Sark as a singular scale to functionally pendulum summon every Horus name from grave. This all while also having summons that don't start a chain, so as to be difficult to respond to, along with insanely powerful protection and control effects. Horus conveys the real problem Konami had with Pendulum was not the summoning of 5 guys, it's the fact that a Pendulum summon was only 1 draw off Max C. Wonderful priorities. Lastly, addressing the issue with going second. While turn 0 cards are a great start, you can't rely on that design all the time for the same reason you can't with hand traps. And like I said with paced out combos, you can't design archetypes to all function the same, even if they are healthier. So ultimately, the going second issue still has to be addressed directly. The best way is with engine cards designed with added benefits if you're going second. Cards with relevant bonus effects if you're going second should be the norm at this point. Not making cards exclusively going second cards, but rather cards that provide the much needed versatility to leverage the game in their favor should they be going second. The tactics cards accomplish this to an extent, allowing you access to powerful cards going second more often than not, while still being usable going first because of hand traps. But talent retains a philosophical issue that hampers the game: the hand rip effect. When you consider called by's relation to hand traps and the importance of them in the game's ecosystem, tactics poses a similar toxic gameplay interaction, making an opponent go down 2 cards simply for attempting to interact. Thrust, on the other hand, feels like a far more well-tuned take on this design, allowing you to set any normal spell or trap if your opponent activated a monster effect, but it can't be flipped, with the added caveat that you can add it to your hand instead should they control a monster. While this can, and was likely intended to get talent, it's a way for decks to potentially grab a useful engine piece. So while it may not be an engine card that decks can rely on to consistently boost them, it's a card that genuinely helps decks perform when they do see it. But I don't want this type of design to be an excuse to neglect the design of archetypes themselves. An engine design like the new For Hire quick play spell is an overall better direction for design. It lets you summon 2 names instead of 1 if you're going second, making it way more potent in the context of going second, which is what decks need. This design leads to a card that's always good and makes them better going second, giving the deck itself the capacity to perform well regardless of the dice roll, as well as depending on a specific draw. The main reason why I dislike the philosophy behind typical board riggers is that they're clearly designed for one specific scenario and tend to invalidate gameplay when they do resolve, all while having the same issues as hand traps in that you have to just draw them to solve game balance, leaving the cards in question entirely useless out of that specific context, a context that is born of unhealthy game balance. Making archetypes with contingencies for going second is a much healthier philosophy overall. Conditions for additional effects is the best step forward for going second design, making archetypes competent no matter the coin flip. That's what it means to have the game actually feel balanced, something you'd assume was common sense. There are a multitude of conditions that specify going second without outright saying it. If your opponent controls more monsters than you do, if your opponent has less cards in the extra deck than you, a card needing the battle phase, or by extension main phase 2, your opponent summons the previous or current turn. It's just a matter of using these principles in design for far more effective cards that actually address the imbalance in going second. These are means to properly address going second directly, while still providing utility for archetypes at all times. Pendulum specifically could lean into design around having more cards in the extra deck than the opponent, not only because it would help them going second, but because pendulums go into the face-up extra, making it so they can still get those benefits going first, but with setup. It's a chance to utilize the intrinsic mechanical design of pendulum to give them a unique game balance. It's a type of design to highlight over hard locks on archetypes. Another more subtle issue with going second is the nature of drawing multiples. Most cards are hard once per turns, for good reason, and of course, most are crucial to the deck's functionality on a consistent basis. So it's not like you're going to short out on copies, but anytime you see multiples in the opener, it functionally means you have completely dead cards, which makes going second an even more miserable experience. When every card is absolutely critical to pushing the game in your favor, having dead cards that you know you couldn't just cut feels bad. Wicked Tune Synchro is a card that I absolutely love because it elegantly addresses this. It's a quick play search spell for the archetype, but what makes it special is its specific design. It's twice per turn as opposed to the usual hard once per turn, while also being a quick play. This design on Synchro makes it so drawing multiple copies isn't a major setback. Even 3 copies aren't bad. Since it's a quick play, you can set the third and use it on your opponent's turn. And since it lets you perform a synchro summon afterwards, it creates a piece of interaction. This sort of design should be more common. Design that addresses the need to play cards in multiples and accentuates unique design to balance it out of being broken. While I can appreciate the Charmies actually carry a similar sentiment, they're still awful. Allowing you to use another Charmy prevents hands with multiple being abysmal, which is obviously what you want going second. But this is on the Charmies. They're just Diet Max C. The amount of times a second Charmy has been chained to the first being stopped only serves to rebrand the Max C versus Called By minigame. This design philosophy needs to be present in Engine for archetypes, and it has to be genuinely meaningful. Sulfur Happiness is another card that addresses the issue of drawing multiples. It toes the line around multiple different effects well. While so many cards either overwhelm with numerous effects in one turn, or only use one effect per turn to the active detriment to the card, Happiness gets it right by having multiple good effects that can only be activated per copy. It functionally crams 3 cards into one for the sake of brevity, while also serving to make the card's application more situational, which naturally means more varied use from it, especially should you draw 2 of it. Cards that genuinely help archetypes contest established boards, while also serving as a way to generally help the deck's plays going first, is a much better design philosophy for modern cards. Designing crucial cards to not be worthless should you draw multiple alleviates more of the issues with going second. It's the type of design that needs to see more experimentation. There's also design philosophy like Earthbound Prison. Not only does it have an effect to negate an opponent's monster, clearly addressing playing it going second, it has an insurance policy. Field spells are often crucial to the functionality of decks, which then makes it pretty easy to pull the rug out from underneath said deck. Prison functionally says, if your opponent destroys this card, kill them. It's a bit of an extreme solution to deterring negation and destruction, but as long as the card itself doesn't outright stop your opponent from interacting entirely, like Sangan Summoning or Dreadful Dolls, and the deck's intrinsic design isn't egregious, this deterrent clause is welcome on occasion, since it only serves to directly address the uphill battle that is going second. It's a type of philosophy that insulates the deck while not just ending the game on the spot for existing. A lot of the current philosophy behind Yu-Gi-Oh's gameplay is an endless Ouroboros effect, constantly trying to consume itself by way of suppressing itself, but it can't consume itself. Unreliable design can't be relied upon to balance a game, so the solution is simple: break the cycle and start balancing the game on a wider scale. As I've said, the game doesn't have to reset itself, it just has to meaningfully rein in what modern Yu-Gi-Oh is currently. condense it into the very best that it can be. Their approach to correct course with more recent archetypal design is great, but the many missteps and blatant disregard for the game's health make it seem as though Yu-Gi-Oh! Will never truly be in a good place. It doesn't matter how many steps they take forward if each is subsequently accompanied by 2 backwards. As of now, I'm not sure Konami wants the game to be healthy, given the evident desire to sell you on decks with auto wins that actively damage the integrity of the game. There are multiple different formats made up by people playing the game. Formats people love and enjoy engaging with. While they may be drastically different in direction from one another, one thing remains a consistent theme: the reality that the game is fun at its core. But the clear structure and management of the main game is only a hindrance to that fact. This isn't because everyone outside of Konami is Einstein, it's because everyone at Konami is too busy watching little Einsteins. You can make a new format like Genesis to expand how people approach the game, make healthier decisions for game balance, but ultimately, the core game itself needs to shift philosophy. That isn't going to change. They can design cards to be more healthy, fun, engaging, and skill testing, but they'll ultimately refuse to address the systematic issues that keep us from playing Yu-Gi-Oh! At its core. I want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! We all want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! We already know the best course of action for the game. It's only a matter of going forward with it, taking no steps back. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that's meant to be enjoyed, contrary to popular belief. Konami just has to put in the actual effort to make that the reality that it always should have been. If you're here solely just for the subject of this video, you can close tab or click off to another video now. I'm gonna wrap up this video talking about the channel for those who care. I've not been in the mood to make videos the past few months. The September ban list made me feel entirely disillusioned with the game. The same level of disillusion I felt when Pendulum was ruined entirely by Master Rule 4. The fact that the takeaway from such a good format was to hit the cards that made it good, while continuing to neglect the very cards that still harm the game's health. Seeing everyone say that list was good just made me feel alone. Wanting the game to improve for the better means nothing. As long as things look like they've changed, it's good enough. I was excited to make a follow-up video on Vanquished Soul since it got its support, but considering the hits, it just felt pointless. Since I now know Konami just doesn't care about design. They can make a good deck. They can create cards that are genuinely well-balanced and competitively viable. They can make something truly skill-testing. But once they're no longer moving product, it gets cut. But the tumors that continue to sell future cards stick around, regardless of how many times people mention their detrimental impact on the game, because they're ultimately a singular card to sell a new deck rather than a deck you can keep playing. I've always taken an optimistic approach to archetypes and pointed out ways to build and iterate on them. I believe nothing is beyond salvation. It's why I have a series discussing the very card types that Konami neglects. Vanquished Soul becoming a top tier deck was proof that I was right to believe so. But then the decision to hit it, and not ban cards like Droll, Shifter, and there can be only one, all it told me is my optimism is wasted. The game's health is not their primary concern. So I decided I'd take a break since I felt zero motivation to make any videos on the game. But in doing so, it had finally become clear to me. I am trapped by this game, algorithmically and mentally. Algorithmically, I have to keep making Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos since that's where most of my viewer base is and comes from. And doing anything else is going to be sabotaged because that viewer base isn't going to engage with those videos. And because of that, YouTube, instead of figuring out that it should be pushing it to a newer audience, will assume because it's not doing well with my existing audience that the video isn't worth pushing in general. I made a separate Sonic channel and moved my Sonic videos there. I could make a channel pertaining to multiple different topics that I want to talk about, and even if they're all slow to start up, the odds of them doing better in the long run increases. I don't want to do that unless I have to. I only intend to keep it at the Sonic channel, since it seems Sonic is the thing that suffers the most from it. But this is where we get to the mentally trapped part. I don't feel happy making content on other subjects, because I feel entirely incapable of expressing myself to the extent that I truly want to with them. I desperately want to make videos on anything else, but I feel entirely resigned to the fact I can't, as they tend to fall flat when I read them over and work on them. Most of the time, scripts don't even get past 10 pages, and when that's the case, it sinks in that I really didn't have as much to say about it as I thought. So I don't feel a reason to make it if it's that shallow. I don't feel satisfied and don't feel as though I can work them into something satisfying. It feels like the only thing I can express myself without this concern is with Yu-Gi-Oh! There are subjects I want to cover, then I'll see someone else cover it and feel entirely demotivated to work on it. I wanted to make a video about all the Sonic racing games, reflecting mostly on riders and the switch to the racing series. But then by the time I started to actually work that out, they released a new game, and now everyone and their mother's already made a video like that. So I can't reason to myself that it's worth it to even attempt to make that video, because it's not like I'm gonna add a whole lot to what's already become an oversaturated video genre. As a result, I'm trapped making Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos because it's the only thing I feel comfortable with working on. But the truth is, I never intended to be a Yu-Gi-tuber. Hell, everyone under the sun slaps YGO in their name, and I consciously chose not to because I didn't intend for it to be my core identity. It's just the easiest avenue for me to create videos without feeling any stress around production. It certainly doesn't help that other endeavors require a lot of recording to be done and sorted through, as well as better hardware to do so, along with the memory space to actually have them be more passive projects. I just wish it wasn't the only thing I felt comfortable making videos for, and now that I wanted to ease up on it, I couldn't because it means jumping into the deep end, knowing full well that I'm going to drown. But this isn't the worst of it, because realistically, I can just take my time and work myself out of this rut. This has been the worst year of my life, due to a number of personal life struggles. For the first time in my life, I've truly understood what it feels like to be at rock bottom. Everything I mentioned before, those are just minor setbacks. Something I can always push through with a little time, but I couldn't push through everything else that life had to throw at me. It's been really hard to get in a productive headspace these past few months. Paired with feeling trapped, it was impossible to make any consistent headway. While I'm finding my footing now, it's still an uphill battle. I make videos because of an innate desire to express myself, and I don't want Yu-Gi-Oh! To be the only way I do that consistently, but I feel too inadequate to change that. While I don't intend to stop making Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, I intend to do more than just it. These are some non-Yu-Gi-Oh! Projects that I've been meaning to get to. These are videos that I've wanted to make for a long time, but I just wasn't feeling the drive to do so. That changes here. I only hope that I can get to a point where I actually do so comfortably. But I guess if I'm at rock bottom now, the only way forward is up. And I have no intentions of going back anymore.